Before we begin, let yourself grow still, and let the room soften around you. And if you feel like it, you might leave a comment telling us how many nights you have fallen asleep to these gentle stories. For it is always lovely to know that you are there. If these long, gentle tales bring you rest, you may wish to subscribe, so more of them can quietly find you on the nights to come. There is nothing you need to do now but breathe, and let the weight of the day slip away from your shoulders, one slow breath at a time. Tonight, we are going to wander together through the whole long saga of Dune by way of its many endings, gathering up the great depths of that vast story and holding each one softly in turn. This may sound like a heavy thing to carry into the quiet before sleep, and yet it is not, for we do not come to these depths to be frightened or shaken. We come to understand them, to sit beside each one the way you might sit beside a candle as it burns low, watching the flames settle and grow calm. Every person we meet had a life and a reason and a place in the great turning of the tale, and every ending, however sorrowful, opened the way for what came after. So let your eyes close whenever they wish to close, and let your breathing slow, for there is nothing here you need to solve, and nowhere you need to be. We will move gently and in order, beginning on the desert world of Arrakis in the days when House Atreides first fell, and traveling onward across the long ages that follow. We will pause at the poisoned tooth of Duke Leto, and at the sorrowful end of the doctor who betrayed him, and at the loyal old Mentat who chose his own quiet leaving. We will walk beside the planetologist left alone beneath the open sky, and the desert warrior whose challenge marked a beginning, and the cruel lords of House Harkonnen swept away one by one. We will follow the swordmaster who died to save a boy and was born again across the centuries, and we will come at last to the passing of Chani and of Paul into the sand, and of the great God Emperor who gave up everything so that others might be free. None of this is anything you must hold on to. There is nothing here to fear and nothing to remember, only a long, slow procession of stories to drift through as sleep gathers around you. Let the words move over you like a warm tide going out. Let each chapter carry you a little further from the waking world, softer than the one before it. Settle in now, let your body grow heavy and warm, and let us begin to walk gently among the fallen of Dune. There is a way of coming to the endings of a great story that is gentle rather than fearful, and it is that way we will follow tonight. The Saga of Dune is a long tale of many closings, of lives that flared and faded across the sand and across the slow turning of the years. And before we walk among any single one of them, let us simply gather them softly before us, the way you might gather smooth stones into your palm at the edge of a quiet shore. We are not here to be startled. We are here to understand. And understanding, as you already know somewhere deep in your resting mind, is one of the kindest things two people can do together in the dark. So let yourself settle a little deeper now. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, and let your shoulders come down away from your ears, and let the long breath you have been holding without knowing it slip out of you and into the room. There is nothing here that asks anything of you. There is only a slow procession of stories, and my voice moving through them, and the growing warmth of sleep drawing near. The tale we are about to walk through is very old and very wide, and it spans more time than any single life could ever hold. It begins upon a desert world, on a planet of endless dunes and burning days and cold, clean nights, and it reaches forward across thousands upon thousands of years, past the fall of houses and the rise of an emperor, and the slow, patient work of those who tried to shape what was to come. Along that great arc, many people reach the end of their part in the story. Some are young and some are old, Some are loved by everyone around them, and some are feared. Some meet their ending with open eyes, and some are taken by surprise. And yet each of them, without exception, was once a living soul with a reason and a longing and a place in the turning of the whole. And each of their endings, however sorrowful it may sound, opened some quiet door through which the story could keep walking. That is the spirit in which we will meet them. Not as things to dread, but as candles we sit beside as they burn low, watching the flames settle and grow calm rather than flinching from it. A candle burning down is not a frightening thing. It is only the natural completion of what a candle is for. It gives its light freely until the light is spent, and then the room holds its warmth a little longer, and then the quiet comes. So it is with each of the lives we will visit. We will sit beside them, and we will watch the flames settle, and we will let the quiet come without fear. We will move gently, and we will move in order, which is a comfort all its own, for there is nothing to puzzle out and nowhere to hurry. We will begin where the great story begins, in the days when a proud family first came to the desert world and first fell there, and we will let one ending lead softly into the next. We will pause beside a desert warrior whose challenge marked the very start of a long and heavy road for a young man who did not want to walk it. We will sit with a captured duke and the small hidden mercy folded into his final hour. We will keep company with a doctor whose sorrow and whose betrayal were braided so tightly together that even his ending carried within it a secret kindness. We will walk out beneath the open sky beside a dreamer who wished to make the desert bloom and who was given back to the sand he loved. And this is only the beginning of the long road. Further on, across the ages, there are swordsmen and emperors and children born already knowing too much. And there are those who chose to give up their very bodies for the sake of people who would not be born for 1,000 years. We will come to all of them in time, each in its turn, each held as softly as the last. But none of that is for you to hold on to now. There is nothing here to memorize, nothing to carry, nothing you must keep. The names may drift through you like leaves on slow water and float away again. And that is exactly right. You are not here to study. You are here to rest. Let me say plainly the promise that runs beneath all of this, so that your resting mind can lean on it and let go. We will treat every passing as a soft and human thing. We will not linger on pain, and we will not sharpen any fear. Where a death was cruel in the telling of the great tale, we will speak of the person rather than the cruelty, of who they were rather than how they suffered. And at the close of every chapter, without fail, the words will turn back toward calm and gather you gently again toward sleep, so that you never need to brace yourself, never need to keep one small part of yourself awake and on guard. You may let all of yourself rest. That is the whole purpose of these long nights, and it is the whole purpose of this one. There is a strange and lovely truth hidden inside a story made of endings, and it is this. When you look at a single ending up close, it can seem like only a loss, a light going out. But when you step back and let many endings stand together, as we are letting them stand together now, you begin to see how each one made room for what followed. The grief and the meaning are woven from the same thread. The desert warrior gives way to the beginning of a great destiny. The fallen duke gives way to the survival of his son. The dreamer of a green world gives way to the slow keeping of that dream by others. Nothing is truly wasted in a story this large. Every closing pours itself, quietly, into the next opening. You do not need to work any of that out tonight. You need only let it rest against you like a warm blanket and know that it is there. So breathe, slow and easy, and let the desert world begin to take shape in the soft dark behind your eyes. Feel the great dunes lying still under a wide sky, the sand cooling now that the fierce day is done, the horizon clean and endless and quiet. This is where we begin, and there is no hurry to arrive. We have all the long night ahead of us, and the whole saga to wander through, one gentle ending at a time. Think, if it soothes you, of the way a traveler might cross those dunes at dusk, unhurried, in no danger, simply walking as the light softens and the first stars come out. That is how we will move through this long tale, at the pace of a slow walk across cooling sand, pausing wherever we wish, lingering as long as feels kind, never rushing and never straining toward the next thing. There is no destination we must reach and no hour by which we must arrive. The whole point of the walk is the walking itself, the gentle passing of one quiet place into another, the way one soft breath passes into the next without any effort at all. You may let your mind wander off the path whenever it likes, and drift into sleep whenever it likes, and none of that will be a failure, for sleep is exactly where this long walk is meant to lead. Let your body grow heavy and warm where it rests. Let the last small tensions of the day loosen in your hands and in your jaw and behind your eyes. There is nothing you must do and nowhere you must be. The stones are gathered in our palm, the candles are set out in their long, soft row, and we will visit them one by one, slowly, kindly, without fear. For now, that is enough. Let the sand cool, let the sky darken, let the quiet gather around you, and let yourself begin to drift, carried on the first slow breath of a very long and very peaceful night. Let us walk out now onto the sand of Arrakis in the earliest days of the great story, when a young man named Paul Atreides and his mother Jessica were newly cast out from the world they had known. Their house had fallen in the night, and they had fled into the deep desert with almost nothing, and there, among the rocks and the dunes, they had been found by the Fremen, the desert people who lived where no one else could survive. It is here, in the shelter of a Fremen band, that we meet the first of the many endings we have gathered to hold tonight, and it is a quiet and sorrowful one, and we will hold it very gently. Among the Fremen there was a warrior named Jamis. He was a proud man and a capable one, hardened by a life spent wringing survival out of a world that gave nothing freely. He had learned the desert the hard way, as all of his people had, and he had earned his place among them with his hands and his will. When the strangers were brought into the band, something in the arrangement of things unsettled him, some sense that the newcomers were being given a standing he did not think they had earned. And so, by the old law of the tribe, a law as old as the sand itself, Jamis called for single combat. It was his right, and he took it, not out of simple cruelty, but out of a wounded pride and a warrior's certainty that he understood what stood before him. But he did not understand. That is the sorrow woven through this ending. Jamis looked at Paul and saw a boy, slight and untested, soft from a life lived in green places far from the desert. He could not have known that this boy had been trained since before he could walk in the deep and difficult arts of his house, that beneath the softness lay a discipline few grown warriors could match. Jamis measured the young man before him and found him small, and in that gentle misjudgment lay the turning of everything that came after. He was not a fool. He simply could not see what was hidden. Very few of us ever can. The custom required that the two of them meet with blades, alone, in the sight of the band, and that only one of them would walk away. For Paul, this was a terrible threshold, though those watching may not have understood how terrible. He had been raised to value life, and he had never taken one. He had never stood before another living person knowing that the closing of this hour meant the ending of one of them. He did not want this. Everything gentle in him drew back from it, and yet the law was the law, and to refuse it was to bring ruin upon himself and his mother both. And so, with a heavy and unwilling heart, he stepped forward to meet the warrior who had challenged him. We will not linger on the sharpness of the fight itself, for that is not what matters here, and it is not why we have come. What matters is what moved beneath it. Jameis fought with all the skill of his hard-won years, quick and fierce and sure, expecting the boy to falter and fall. And Paul, moving with the strange composure that had been drilled into him across a childhood of patient training, did not falter. He turned the warrior's certainty against him, not with hatred, for he felt no hatred, but with a kind of sorrowful attention, watching, waiting, hoping even in the middle of it, for some way the ending might be softened. There was no such way. In the end, the young man prevailed, and the warrior Jameis lay still upon the sand, and the first life that Paul Atreides ever took was taken there, beneath the wide desert sky. What we should carry from this ending, softly, is not the loss alone, but the weight of it upon the one who caused it. Paul did not celebrate. There was no triumph in him. Instead, there settled over the young man a grief that he had not expected and did not know how to hold. The strange and heavy grief of having ended a life that had done him no lasting wrong. A man who had only misjudged him and paid for that small blindness with everything he had. Paul mourned Jameis even as he stood victorious over him. He wept quietly, in a way the desert people found both surprising and strangely fitting, for among them the giving of moisture to the dead was a great honor, the highest gift a living body could offer. The boy's tears, which came from sorrow and not from custom, were received by the Fremen as a mark of deep and genuine respect. And in that moment, something passed between the stranger and the people of the sand, a first thread of belonging woven out of grief. And so Jameis, who could not have known what he was challenging, gave more in his ending than he could have given in his life. His death marked a beginning, though he never saw it. It was the first step of a long and heavy road that Paul would walk for the rest of his days, a road he had not chosen and often wished he could set down, and it began here, with a proud warrior and a reluctant boy and a fight that neither of them truly wanted. The Fremen took the young man more fully into their band after that. They gave him a place, and in time a name, and the current of the great story gathered around him and began to carry him forward. All of that flowed from this quiet ending on the sand. Let us set this one down now, gently, the way you would set down something fragile that you did not want to break. Jameis was a proud man who loved his people and his desert and misjudged a single stranger. And that is the whole of his sorrow, and it is enough, and we will leave it there without sharpening it further. He was met with respect at the last, honored with the tears of the very one who had bested him, and remembered in the telling of the great tale, not as a villain, but as the beginning of something vast. There are far worse things to be than the first quiet turning of a great wheel. Feel now how the desert cools around this memory. The band withdraws into the rocks. The wide sky darkens toward its clean and starlit night. The sand, which holds the warmth of the day a little while and then lets it go, is letting the day go now, breath by breath. The way you are letting the day go, breath by breath. There is nothing here that needs to trouble you. A proud man was met with honor. A reluctant boy learned the weight of the road ahead and wept for it, and that weeping was received as a gift. The wheel turned once, softly, and the story went on. Picture the band drawing back into the shelter of the rocks, their day's hard work done, settling into the safety of stone and shadow as the desert night comes down. There is a deep peace in arresting people at the end of a long day, a peace that asks nothing and fears nothing, and you may let a little of that peace come into you now. So let your own breathing slow to match the slow cooling of the sand. Let your hands lie open and easy. Let the small held places in your body unclench one by one, and let this first ending drift away from you like a warm current going quietly out to sea. You do not need to carry it. You need only to have sat beside it for a little while, kindly, and now to let it go. Rest now. The night is long and gentle, and there is nothing more for you to do than breathe and soften and drift a little further toward sleep. Tonight, we come to the ending of a good man, a man who carried himself with such steadiness and such warmth that those who served him would have followed him anywhere, and who fell not through any failing of his own, but through a betrayal woven quietly around him in the dark. His name was Leto Atreides, the Duke of his house, the father of the young man we have already begun to follow, and his ending is one of dignity held on to against every effort to strip it away. Let us come to it slowly, and let us hold it with the respect it deserves, for there is a strange and steadying comfort in the way this man met his final hour. Duke Leto had brought his house to the desert world of Arrakis at the command of the Emperor, knowing even as he came that the command was a trap laid for him. He was a shrewd man, and he could read the shape of the danger closing around his family, and yet he went, because duty required it, and because he hoped, against the odds, to make something lasting out of the peril. He was beloved. That is the first thing to hold about him. His people loved him, not out of fear, but out of a genuine devotion, for he was the kind of leader who spent himself for those beneath him and asked little in return, a man whose loyalty ran downward as fiercely as he asked loyalty to run upward. Such men are rare, and their fall is felt more deeply than the fall of harder rulers. The trap closed in the night. The house was betrayed from within, its defenses open to an enemy that had waited a long time for this hour, the Baron of the rival House of Harkonnen, who had nursed a cold and patient hatred for the Atreides across many years. In the chaos and the collapse, the Duke was taken. He was not slain in the fighting. He was captured, drugged into helplessness, and carried before the very enemy who had engineered his ruin to be gloated over in the hour of the Baron's triumph. It would have been easy, in such a moment, for a lesser man to be wholly broken, stripped of every last shred of himself, and made only a thing to be mocked. But even here, even bound and helpless, the Duke was not entirely without a weapon, for there had been, folded into the betrayal, a small and secret mercy that no one in the enemy's camp suspected. The house physician, a man whose own sorrows we will come to in their turn, had done a terrible thing under a terrible compulsion and had opened the way for the house to fall. Yet even as he did it, this same physician had planted a hidden gift within the Duke, a last chance to strike a single blow. He had placed, within a false tooth set into the Duke's own mouth, a capsule holding a killing gas so that at the right moment, if the Duke could bring himself to it, he might crush the tooth and release the poison and take his enemy down with him. It was a grim and desperate mercy, offered by a broken man to a betrayed one, a way to turn defeat into one last act of will. And so the Duke, drugged and dying and brought low before the man who had destroyed everything he loved, gathered what remained of himself for a final purpose. He did not rage, he did not beg. He held, in the deepest part of himself, the memory of the family he was trying still to protect. The son and the woman he loved who had fled into the desert and whom he prayed had escaped. And with that memory steadying him, he bit down, and broke the tooth and released the gas into the close air of that room. The killing cloud spread. It did not reach the man it was most meant to reach, for the Baron, quick and wary even in his triumph, escaped the worst of it. But others fell, and the Duke had struck his blow, the last blow he would ever strike, aimed at the enemy of his house in the final moment of his own life. Leto Atreides died there, in the hour of his defeat, and yet it would be wrong to remember him as defeated. He died, having refused to be made merely a victim. He died with his will intact, having reached out one final time toward the enemy who thought him wholly broken, having struck for the family he could not save in any other way. His body failed, but the man himself, the thing that made him who he was, did not fail. It held. And that holding, that quiet, unyielding dignity in the face of ruin, is what we should carry away from his ending, softly, as the gift it truly is. There is a comfort in it, strange as that may seem to say of a death. The Duke had spent his whole life giving himself away for others, and in his last moment he was still giving, still spending himself for the ones he loved. His ending did not undo his life. It completed it. He was exactly, at the last, the man he had always been, loyal and shrewd and unbroken, and there is a deep and settling peace in the sight of a person who meets the end as fully themselves as they lived. He was not made small by his enemies. If anything, he was made larger, for the memory of him, the memory of the good Duke who struck one final blow with his dying breath, would burn on in the hearts of those who loved him long after the men who defeated him had themselves been swept away. And his son survived. That is the quiet thread that runs beneath the sorrow. The very reason the Duke had held on, the family he was trying to protect, had slipped free into the desert and would carry his house forward into a future the Baron could not imagine. The Duke did not live to know it for certain, but his hope was true. His fall made room for his son's rising, as so many endings in this long tale make room for the risings that follow them. The light of him did not go out. It passed onward, into the boy in the desert, and it went on burning there. So let us set down the ending of Duke Leto, gently now, with honor, the way his own people would have wished. A good man, beloved by those he led, betrayed through no fault of his own, met his final hour with his dignity whole and his will unbroken, struck one last blow for the family he loved, and died as fully himself as he had always lived. There is no need to be frightened of an ending like that. There is only room to be moved by it, and then to let it rest. Feel now how the night settles over this memory, clean and quiet and deep. The chaos of the fall has passed. The desert lies still under its cold, bright stars, and somewhere out in that vastness, the ones the Duke loved are safe, carrying him with them. Let that safety settle over you too. Let the steadiness of that good man become a steadiness in you, an unclenching, a slow letting go of everything you have been holding through the day. His story is complete, and it is well, and you may set it down. Let your breathing lengthen and soften. Let the warmth gather in your chest and spread out to the ends of your hands. There is nothing left here to fear and nothing left to do. A good man was true to the end, and the ones he loved were carried safely forward, and the story goes on. Rest now in that quiet knowing, and let yourself drift a little deeper, a little further, gently down towards sleep. Some endings are simple sorrows, and some are tangled ones, and tonight we come to one of the most tangled and most human of them all. The ending of a man who did a terrible thing for the most understandable of reasons, and whose sorrow was so deep that it colored everything around it. His name was Wellington Yue, and he was a physician and he was a traitor, and he was also, in his own broken way, a savior. We will hold all of those truths at once tonight, softly, without judgment, for a person is rarely only one thing, and this man least of all. Dr. Yue belonged to a great and trusted order of physicians, an order so deeply conditioned toward the preservation of life that its members were thought to be utterly incapable of causing harm. To be one of them was to carry a mark that told the whole of the human worlds that here was a healer who could never betray a patient, a person made safe beyond all doubt. Duke Leto trusted him for exactly this reason, took him into the closest circle of the household, believed him to be one of the few people alive who could never be turned against the family. And that trust was not foolish. By everything the worlds understood, it was the safest trust a man could give. But the enemies of the house had found the one crack in a wall that everyone believed to be seamless. They had taken the doctor's wife, the person he loved above all others, and they held her, and they let him believe that if he would only do the one unthinkable thing, if he would only open the way for the house to fall, then she might be spared and returned to him. It was a lie, of course. The men who held her had no intention of keeping any promise. But a man in love and in terror does not weigh such things coldly. He reaches for the thread of hope he is offered, however thin, because the alternative is to abandon the one he loves to certain suffering. And so the unbreakable physician was broken, not through any weakness of his own making, but through the cruelest possible use of the deepest love he had. We should be careful tonight, not to be hard on him. It is easy, from a safe distance, to say what a person should do when everything they love is held hostage. It is far harder to stand in that place and choose well. And few of us can honestly say we would have chosen better. Yue did a terrible thing. He opened the way for a good house to fall, and good people died because of it, and he knew, even as he did it, the weight of what he was doing. He was not a cold man. He was a man drowning, reaching for the only hand that seemed to be offered to him, and finding too late that the hand was not real. And here is where his ending turns from simple betrayal into something far more human and far more moving. For even as he did the unforgivable, some deep and unbroken part of him refused to be wholly turned. He could not save the house, but he could plant, within its fall, the seeds of a rescue. It was Yue who arranged that the Duke's wife and son should have a chance to escape into the desert rather than simply be killed. It was Yue who hid help for them, supplies and a way out, so that the future of the house he was helping to destroy might yet survive in secret. And it was Yue who set within the Duke's own mouth the poisoned tooth we have already spoken of, the last weapon that let the fallen Duke strike a final blow. Even in his betrayal, he was trying, desperately, to fold a mercy into the ruin. His treachery and his loyalty were braided so tightly together that neither can be spoken of without the other. The men who used him had no gratitude and no honor, and they kept none of the promises that had bound him. His usefulness to them ended the moment the house had fallen, and once he was no longer needed, the cruelty of his masters spared him nothing. He was not given the reunion he had been promised. He was not given his wife, who was already beyond any saving. He was not given peace or thanks or even the small mercy of a quiet ending. The night of the fall that he had helped to bring about was also the night of his own ending, and he did not outlive it. He died without the one thing he had thrown away everything to gain, and that is the sharpest sorrow in his whole sad story. And yet, we do not have to leave him there, in the bare cold fact of his loss, and we will not, for that would be to see only half of him, because before he died, he had already done the things that mattered most. The wife he could not save was beyond his reach, but the woman and the boy he had chosen at the last, to protect, were slipping away into the desert with the help he had hidden for them, carrying the future of the house with them. The Duke he had betrayed had been given, by Yue's own hand, the means to strike one final blow. The doctor's sorrow was real, and it was deep, but it was not empty. It carried within it a quiet, redeeming purpose, a purpose that outlived the man himself and reached forward into the survival of the very people his betrayal had endangered. That is the thing to hold softly about Wellington Yue. He was not a monster, though he did a monstrous thing. He was a loving man, cornered by a cruelty he could not escape, who did the wrong thing for a reason almost anyone could understand, and who then spent what little freedom remained to him trying to make it right. His ending was a lonely one, without the reunion he longed for and without peace, and we will not pretend otherwise. But folded into that loneliness was a mercy that saved the future of a house and let a betrayed duke die with his dignity intact. There is a kind of quiet grace in a man who, having fallen as far as he had fallen, still reached back toward the good. We can grieve for him and forgive him in the same soft breath, and I think, tonight, that is exactly what we will do. So let us set his tangled sorrow down now, gently, without harshness and without fear. A loving man was broken by the cruelest of pressures, did a terrible thing, and then hid within that ruin the seeds of a rescue that outlived him. He died alone and unrewarded, and yet the good he managed even in his darkest hour went on quietly working long after he was gone. That is not nothing. In a story this large and this hard, it is a great deal. Feel now how the night deepens and softens around this memory. The fall is over. Its noise has faded into silence, and the desert lies quiet and vast beneath the stars. And out in that quiet, the ones the doctor chose to save are safe and moving toward their future. Let the tangle of his story loosen as you breathe, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling at it. There is nothing here for you to solve, and no one here for you to judge. There is only a sad and human man who tried, at the last, to do a little good, and the mercy he managed, and the quiet that follows. Let your breath grow slow and even. Let the tightness ease out of your brow and your jaw and your hands. A broken man reached back toward the good, and it was not wasted, and the ones he saved went on. Rest now in that gentle understanding, and let it carry you, soft and warm and unafraid, a little further down into the deep quiet of sleep. Tonight we walk out into the deep desert to sit beside a dreamer, and his ending is one of the quietest and most reflective in all the long saga. A passing so soft that it feels less like a death than a slow surrender into the arms of the very world he loved. His name was Liet Kynes, and he was a man of two lives braided into one. And to understand the gentleness of his ending, we must first understand the size of the dream he carried. By the reckoning of the empire, Kynes was a servant of the throne, a planetologist sent to study the desert world and keep account of it for distant masters who cared only for what could be taken from it. He wore that role well, and it gave him standing and freedom to move where he wished across the endless dunes. But beneath that official life, he carried a second and far greater one, secret and burning, inherited from his own father before him. For Kynes did not see the desert world merely as a place to be measured and taxed. He saw it as a garden waiting to be born. He dreamed, with a patience that stretched across generations, of turning that dry and burning world green, of coaxing water back into the sand, of raising, over the long, slow centuries, forests and pools and living fields where now there was only endless dune. It was a dream too large for one lifetime, and he knew it, and he gave himself to it anyway. teaching it quietly to the desert people so that it might outlive him and be carried forward by hands he would never see. That is the man we should hold in our minds tonight before we come to his ending. Not a functionary, but a dreamer of the deepest kind. A man in love with a future he would not live to enter, working patiently toward a green world for the sake of children not yet born. There is something wonderfully steadying about such a person, someone whose life points beyond itself, whose real work is a gift laid down for those who come after. Hold that picture of him gently, for it is the truest thing about him, and it is what makes his quiet ending so strangely peaceful rather than merely sad. When the great house fell and the desert world was thrown into turmoil, Kynes found himself caught between the powers struggling over it, and the empire he had served for so long showed at last how little it had ever valued him. He had helped the fugitives, the woman and the young man fleeing into the desert, and for this, and for the simple fact that he knew too much and served too quietly, the empire turned on the man who had served it. He was betrayed and abandoned, taken out into the deep and open desert and left there alone, without a stillsuit to hold his body's moisture, without shelter from the sun, without any of the careful protections that made survival on that world possible even for a moment. To be left so on that world was to be given to the desert itself, quietly and completely. And here is where his ending turns inward and grows soft and becomes something almost tender. For Kynes did not spend his last hours in terror. Alone beneath the wide and open sky, with the heat of the desert gathering around him and his strength slowly leaving him, his thoughts turned not to fear, but to the two great presences that had shaped his whole life. He thought of his father, whose dream he had carried, whose voice and whose vision had guided him across all his years. And it was as though the old man were near him again in those final hours, walking with him one last time across the sand. And he thought of the dream itself, the green world, the water returning to the land, the living planet that might one day rise from the very dunes that were now closing over him. He was dying in the heart of the desert he had spent his life trying to heal, and rather than raging against it, he let his mind rest in the vision of what that desert might someday become. There is a deep gentleness in that. A man given by his enemies to the sand, and instead of meeting his end with bitterness, he met it in the company of his father's memory and the dream of a living world, so that even as the desert took him, he was, in the truest sense, at home. The world he loved was gathering him back into itself, and he did not fight it. Somewhere out in that vastness, the deep processes of the desert stirred and gathered, the slow, blind forces of the world going about their ancient work, and Kynes, the man who had understood those forces better than anyone alive, let himself be drawn down into them. It was the desert reclaiming its own dreamer, quietly, completely, the way the sea reclaims a river that has run at last down to it. We should not sharpen this ending into cruelty, though cruelty set it in motion, for the man himself did not experience it as cruelty at the last. He experienced it as a return. He had spent his whole life pressed close against the living body of that world, learning its secrets, loving its harsh beauty, dreaming of its healing, and in the end, that same world simply gathered him back. There is a rightness in it that softens the sorrow, the rightness of a dreamer swallowed gently by the very thing he dreamed of, dying in the presence of everything he had loved most. His body was given to the desert, but his dream was not. The dream had already been passed on, taught quietly to the desert people, planted in hearts that would carry it forward across the long centuries toward the green world he would never see. His ending closed his own story, but it did not close the story of his dream. So let us set the ending of Liet Kynes down now, softly, with the quiet reverence it asks for. A dreamer of a living world, betrayed by the empire he served and given to the deep desert, met his last hours not with fear, but with the memory of his father and the vision of a green future. And let the world he loved gather him gently back into itself. His dream lived on in other hands. His passing was a return rather than a defeat, the soft closing of a life that had always pointed beyond itself toward something larger and kinder than any single ending. Feel now how the desert quiets around this memory. The fierce heat of the day has spent itself, and the great dunes lie still and cooling beneath a sky filling slowly with stars. That clean and endless desert sky under which the dreamer let himself rest. There is nothing here to frighten you, and nothing to grieve too sharply. A man who loved a world was gathered back into it, thinking of his father and of a green tomorrow, and his dream went on without him toward the future he had imagined. Let that quiet return settle over you the way the cool of night settles over the sand. Imagine the sand itself giving back the heat it gathered through the long day, releasing it slowly into the darkening air, growing cooler and quieter grain by grain, until the whole vast desert lies at rest beneath the stars. Let yourself release the day in just that way, slowly, without effort, giving it back into the dark. Let your breathing slow to the slow rhythm of the cooling desert. Let your body grow heavy and warm and at ease, every held place softening, every thought loosening and drifting away like heat rising from the dunes into the dark. The dreamer is home, the world turns quietly on toward its distant green tomorrow, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. Let yourself sink now, soft and unafraid, down through the deepening quiet, gently and completely, into sleep. Let us settle now beside the long life of Thufir Hawat, the aged mentat of House Atreides, and hold his ending as gently as we would hold anything worn smooth by many years. He was old when we first come to know him, older than almost any other soul in this tale. A man whose face had gathered the lines of a lifetime spent in service. He was the master of assassins for the Atreides, which is a heavy title, and yet the weight he carried was not cruelty, but care. For his whole art was bent toward keeping his duke and his household safe from the countless quiet dangers that circled a great house. Breathe slowly as we sit with him, for there is nothing sharp here, only the long faithfulness of a servant who loved the family he guarded. A mentat is a person trained from youth to think as a machine once thought, to gather facts and turn them over and over until patterns rise from them like shapes appearing out of mist. Thufir had done this for so long that thinking had become the very shape of his being. The stains upon his lips came from the sappho juice that deepened a mentat's powers, and behind those weathered features moved a mind that never truly rested. He had served the father of Duke Leto, and then Leto himself, and he had begun, in the last quiet season of his old age, to watch over the young heir Paul as well, teaching the boy the ways of watching and weighing that had filled his own long years. To Thufir, the House of Atreides was not merely an employer, but the meaning of his days, the thing he had given himself to entirely. Then came the fall, the great betrayal that broke the house upon the sands of Arrakis. And in the ruin of that night, the old mentat was swept away from everyone he had sworn to protect. He was captured, and he came to believe, through a cruel and clever lie, that it was the Lady Jessica who had betrayed the Duke, when in truth the traitor had been another. This false belief settled into him like a splinter beneath the skin, and it shaped the years that followed. For grief and confusion can lead even the wisest mind down a crooked path. Let that sorrow rest lightly upon you, for it is the sorrow of a good man deceived, and deception aimed at the loyal is one of the saddest weapons in any story. The Harkonnens took him into their service, and after them, the Emperor himself, and so the old man who had spent his life guarding one family found himself made to labor for its destroyers. Yet even in that bondage, something in him did not bend. His masters kept him alive and bound to their will by a subtle poison, a residual poison held in his body that required a steady antidote given only by their hand, so that his continued breathing depended upon their continued favor. Imagine the strangeness of it. An old man kept living by the very people he despised. Each new day, a gift from enemies. Each new day, another quiet debt he never asked to owe. He served them because he had to, and because he was watching, always watching, waiting to understand where the true wrong had come from. Through all of this, Thufir kept a secret loyalty folded deep within himself, hidden even from those who thought they had bought him wholly. A mentat can hold two things at once, the outward shape of obedience and the inward truth of the heart, and Thufir held them for a long and lonely time. He let his captors believe they had turned him, and all the while he sifted the facts they let slip, drawing nearer and nearer to the understanding that the house he still loved had been undone not by the woman he had blamed, but by forces far larger and colder. The old mind worked on, patient as stone, and somewhere within it, the love he bore the Atreides burned as steadily as it ever had. At last the moment came that would ask everything of him. Paul had risen, the boy grown into the leader the Fremen called Muad'Dib, and the powers that held Thufir set the old mentat as a final blade to be turned against him. They gave him a means to strike, a hidden weapon meant to end the young man in whom the last hope of the Atreides now lived, and they trusted that their poison and their long control had made him theirs to command. They did not understand, as Jameis long before had not understood, that the true shape of a heart cannot always be read from the outside. They believed they were sending a weapon. They were sending a man who had made his choice long ago and had only been waiting for the room to make it plain. When Thufir at last stood before Paul, the whole weight of his years gathered into a single quiet decision. He could strike and betray the son of the Duke he had loved, and go on breathing a little longer by the grace of his enemies. Or he could refuse, and let that refusal be the end of him, for the poison in his body waited only for the antidote to be withheld. The old mentat, who had spent a lifetime keeping others alive, chose to spend his own life rather than take the one he had sworn in his heart to protect. He would not harm the boy he had helped to raise. He would not lift his hand against the house that had given his years their meaning. And so he let his life run out, quietly, the way a candle gives its last small light, and then is still. It is a tender thing to consider, this ending, for it was not forced upon him but chosen, and in the choosing the old man reclaimed everything the years of bondage had tried to take from him. He had been deceived and bought and bound and kept alive on the sufferance of cruel masters, and yet at the final turning he was wholly himself again. Wholly Atreides, wholly the loyal servant he had always been beneath the outward show. His death was not a defeat handed to him by his enemies, but a last free act given as a gift to the family he loved, the closing note of a long song of devotion. He passed knowing, at the end, where the truth had lain and where his loyalty belonged. There is a great gentleness in an ending like this, the ending of a very old man who has carried a heavy trust for a very long time and is allowed at last to set it down. He had watched over others through countless nights so that they might rest safely, and now his own long watch was over, and he could finally rest as well. The mind that had never ceased its turning grew quiet. The lips stained with the juice of his labors fell still. The weight he had carried for a lifetime slipped from his shoulders as softly as your own weight is slipping from yours in this quiet room. So let the old mentat rest, and let his rest ease your own. Think of him not as a weapon, nor as a captive, but as a faithful heart that endured a long darkness and came through it whole, choosing love over survival at the very last. His loyalty outlasted deception, outlasted bondage, outlasted even the poison meant to bind him, and it carried him gently to a peaceful close. Let your breathing slow as his mind slowed. Let the tension leave your body as the years fell away from his, and let the calm of a long task finally finished settle warmly over you now, drawing you softly and easily down towards sleep. Let us turn now, softly and without fear, to the ending of Glossu Rabban, the man the people of Arrakis came to call the Beast. His is a harder name to say gently than most, for he was a cruel lord, and the sands he ruled remember him as a season of suffering. And yet, even here, in the closing of a brutal life, there is something quiet to understand, and we come to it not to cheer nor to condemn, but simply to watch a heavy thing pass and be gone. Let your breath grow slow as we sit beside even this, for tenderness given to the gentle is easy, and it is the harder mercy, the mercy extended to the cruel, that teaches us most about peace. Rabban was a nephew of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a great thick-bodied man built more for force than for thought. Where his uncle was subtle and his younger brother polished, Rabban was blunt as a hammer, and the family used him as a hammer is used, for the crude work that other hands did not wish to touch. When House Harkonnen took Arrakis after the fall of the Atreides, it was Rabban who was set over the desert world, given the task of ruling it and of squeezing from it every last measure of the precious spice. He was not chosen for his wisdom. He was chosen because the Baron had a colder plan in mind. A plan in which Rabban's very harshness would play a quiet part, though Rabban himself never grasped the shape of it. For the Baron intended that his nephew should oppress the people of Arrakis so terribly and grind them down so completely that when at last a gentler hand was sent to replace him, that gentler hand would seem a blessing by comparison, and the people would love the family that had first tormented them. Rabban was made a tool of this cold design, and he never understood that he was being spent, that his cruelty was itself a kind of currency his uncle meant to trade away for the affection of a conquered world. He believed the strength was his own, and the ruling was his own, and he set about his work with a heavy will, taxing and punishing and pressing the population until the whole planet seethed beneath him. He did not know the desert. That was his deepest failing, deeper than his cruelty. For cruelty at least he understood, while the desert he never understood at all. He saw the Fremen, the hardy people of the deep sand, as little more than a nuisance to be hunted, a scattered rabble of no true account. He did not perceive that beneath the dunes a great and patient people were gathering their strength, a people forged by the harshest world into something far tougher than any soft dweller of the towns could imagine. He counted them as few when they were many, and weak when they were the strongest fighters the galaxy had yet produced. And he never once suspected that the boy who had escaped his family's slaughter now lived among them and was becoming their prophet and their sword. So while Rabban tightened his grip upon the cities and the spice fields, believing he held the whole world in his fist, the true power of Arrakis was rising quietly out beyond the edges of his sight. Muad'Dib had come to the Fremen, and under his leadership the scattered tribes were becoming one, and the raids upon the spice grew bolder, and the losses to House Harkonnen grew heavier season by season. Rabban answered the only way he knew, with more force, more punishment, more pressure, never grasping that each cruelty only fed the fire he was trying to smother. The harder he squeezed, the more the sand slipped between his fingers, and he could not understand why, for the desert was speaking a language he had never learned. There is a strange loneliness in a man like this. If we look closely, a man given great authority and no understanding, set upon a world he could neither read nor win. He grew frustrated and afraid as the raids mounted and the spice faltered, and he sent word to his uncle for aid, and the aid that came was cold comfort, for the Baron cared nothing for Rabban's success beyond its use in his larger scheme. Rabban was alone atop his crumbling rule, hated by the people below him and valued little by the family above him. A heavy man growing heavier with dread as the ground shifted beneath his feet. He had power and no peace, and the two are not the same thing, and he never had the second at all. It is worth pausing here, in the soft dark, to feel the shape of that loneliness, for it is a very human thing beneath all the cruelty. Rabban had been handed a task he could not accomplish, and a world he could not comprehend, and told to succeed at both, and no one had given him the understanding he would have needed to do either. He answered the only way he had ever been taught, with a heavier hand, because the heavy hand was all his family had ever trusted him to be. He had been made into a hammer, and a hammer cannot mend, and cannot soothe, and cannot win the love of a wounded world, and Rabban had never been given the chance to be anything else. There is a sorrow in that, quiet and real, folded beneath the harshness that the people rightly feared. So he tightened and tightened, and the desert waited, and the tension gathered like the stillness before a great storm. He had been placed as a heavy stone upon a rising tide, believing his weight would hold it down, never understanding that no weight is heavy enough to hold back a whole sea. Then came the great uprising, the day the desert itself seemed to rise against the Harkonnens. Muad'Dib led the Fremen out of the deep sand in a storm of righteous fury, and with them came the great worms of Arrakis, ridden into battle as the ancient people had always dreamed they might one day be, and the whole apparatus of Harkonnen rule was swept before them like dust before a wind. In that vast turning of events, that collapse of everything his family had built upon the sand, Rabban was carried away. The world he had ruled with such a heavy hand simply broke apart around him, and the man who had never understood the desert was taken by it in the end, gone in the great confusion of the rising he could neither foresee nor withstand. His was not a noble ending, and we need not pretend that it was, for he had brought much suffering, and he did not repent of it. And yet there is a quiet lesson in the manner of his passing, for all his force availed him nothing at the last. The strength he had trusted, the cruelty he had wielded, the grip he had thought so mighty, all of it dissolved in a moment when the true tide came in. He had built his rule upon fear, and fear is a poor foundation, for it breeds only more of the very rebellion it means to prevent. When the reckoning arrived, there was nothing beneath him to hold, and so he fell with everything else that had been raised upon that faithless ground. Let us not carry anger for him into the quiet of this hour, for anger is a weight, and we are here to set our weights down. It is enough to see him clearly, a blunt and frightened man used by his own family, undone by a world he never troubled to understand, swept away in a rising far greater than himself. Even the cruel grow tired at the last. Even the hard hand finally opens. Even the heaviest life comes at length to its close, and is gathered into the great stillness where all endings are made equal. The dust settles. The sands grow smooth again. The season of suffering passes as all seasons pass. So let the beast be still now, and let his story trouble you no further. The desert that he could not read has closed gently over the place where his rule once stood, and the wind has smoothed away his footprints, and the people he oppressed have been set free by the very rising that carried him off. There is peace in that smoothing, peace in the way the sand forgives even the harshest tread and returns to calm. Let that same smoothing move across your own thoughts now, easing away whatever roughness the day has left in you, and let the quiet gather you softly and carry you down towards sleep. Now we come to Feyd Rautha Harkonnen, the younger nephew of the Baron, the polished and glittering heir who was groomed for greatness and who fell in single combat at the very hour his family had staked everything upon him. His ending is a swifter one than most we have walked among, a duel beneath the shadow of a throne. And yet, we will move through it slowly and softly, as we have moved through all the rest, holding even this last flash of Harkonnen ambition with a gentle hand. Let your body grow heavy as we settle in, for there is nothing here to startle you, only the closing of a bright and dangerous life. Feyd Rautha was in every way the opposite of his brother Rabban. Where Rabban was blunt and thick and brutal, Feyd was smooth and quick and beautiful. A youth the Baron had shaped with great care to be the family's charming face and its hidden blade at once. He was trained to please and to kill in equal measure, to draw the eye and to end a life with the same easy grace, and the Baron looked upon him as the future of House Harkonnen, the one through whom the family might one day rise even to the imperial throne itself. Great hopes were folded into this young man, and he carried them lightly, as the truly dangerous often do, with a smile that gave no hint of the cold calculation beneath. He had been raised on treachery as another child might be raised on stories, taught that a hidden advantage was worth more than any open strength, and that the surest victory was the one your enemy never saw coming. In the fighting arenas of his homeworld, he had been given easy triumphs dressed up as hard ones, gladiators secretly drugged, so that the young heir might appear more skilled than he truly was. And he had learned from this that the world could be arranged in his favor by those who worked in the shadows. And yet, he was genuinely gifted as well, genuinely swift and deadly, so that the arranged victories only sharpened an ability that was already real. He grew into a fighter, both talented and untrustworthy, brilliant in the open and treacherous underneath, exactly the weapon his uncle had wished to forge. When the great turning came upon Arrakis, when the Fremen rose under Muad'Dib and the Harkonnens were broken, and the old emperor himself was brought low upon the desert world, the whole tangled matter came down at last to a single ancient right. Paul had won the field, and the assembled powers of the empire stood defeated before him. And in that moment, the law of the Canley, the formal feud between houses, allowed for the matter to be settled in single combat. Feyd Rautha stepped forward as the emperor's champion. The last blade House Harkonnen and the imperial house together could bring against the young Atreides, and so the long enmity of two great families narrowed to two men and a ring of watching eyes. Consider what that moment held for Feyd. All the grooming of his years, all the hopes his uncle had poured into him, all the arranged victories and the real skill came to rest upon this one contest. He believed he could win, and he had reason to believe it, for he was a superb fighter, and he did not fight fairly. Hidden upon his body, he carried a poisoned needle, a last treachery kept in reserve, so that even should the honest fight turn against him, he might still steal the victory by a cruel and secret means. It was the truest expression of everything he had been taught, this hidden barb, the belief that the world owed him a way to cheat the fair outcome, that no true defeat need ever be accepted so long as one kept a poisoned trick in hand. And so the two young men faced each other, the Atreides and the Harkonnen, the ends of a long feud made flesh. Paul had walked a hard and sorrowful road to reach this ring, and he carried within him a strange clarity, a way of seeing that let him perceive the shapes of things before they fully came to pass. He knew of the hidden needle. He knew the manner of the treachery that would be tried against him. And still, he entered the combat, for it was the way the matter had to be settled, and he met Fade's speed and skill with a discipline that had been tempered in the deep desert among the hardest people alive. The duel itself was swift and dangerous, a contest of two very capable fighters, and there was a moment when it might have gone either way, when Fade's treachery nearly found its mark. But the hidden weapon that had been the young Harkonnen's whole philosophy of victory did not save him. Paul overcame the trick and overcame the man, and in a single close and final exchange the polished air was undone, ended by the very fairness he had never learned to trust. The great hope of House Harkonnen, the beautiful and deadly youth in whom the family had invested all its dreams of empire, fell there beneath the throne he had come to claim, and with him fell the last chance that the Harkonnens might rule through his charm and his blade. There is a sorrow in it, if we look with soft enough eyes. The sorrow of a life shaped entirely by others into a weapon, and then broken in a single stroke. Fade Rotha never truly belonged to himself. From his earliest years he was molded to serve his uncle's ambition, taught to trust nothing and no one, given easy triumphs that hollowed out the meaning of his real gifts, and pointed always toward a throne that was never truly his to want for its own sake. He died young, in the flower of his skill, having been given cunning but never wisdom, given ambition but never peace, given a poisoned needle in place of a settled heart. What he might have been, had gentler hands raised him, we can only wonder, and wondering, we may feel for him a small and quiet kindness. Consider, in the calm of this hour, how much of who we become is placed in us by others before we are old enough to choose. Fade was clever and quick and beautiful, and all of those gifts were bent, from his earliest days, toward the single purpose of another man's design. He was taught that trust was weakness, and that mercy was folly, and that a hidden advantage was the truest wealth a person could hold, and he believed these lessons because they were the only lessons he was ever offered. Instead of choosing, he was aimed like an arrow at a target he had not picked, and like an arrow he flew and struck and was spent, and there was never a moment along the way when anyone asked him what he might have wished to be. That is the deeper sorrow beneath the glitter, and we can hold it gently now without letting it trouble our rest. He was dangerous, and he was treacherous, and yet he was also, in a way he never understood, a life poured entirely into another's ambition. The weapon was laid down. The long shaping came to its end, and the young man who had never been allowed to rest was allowed, at the last, to be still. With his fall, the long feud between the two great houses came at last to its close. The Harkonnens had struck at the Atreides through betrayal and slaughter, and now the final blade the family could raise had been turned aside and stilled, and the bitter contest that had run through so much of this tale was ended not with more treachery, but with its defeat. The hidden needle failed. The arranged advantage came to nothing. In the end, the polished air met an honest strength he could not overcome, and the enmity that had cost so many lives was finally laid to rest upon the sands where it had done its worst work. So let Fade Rotha be still now, this bright and dangerous youth, and let the long feud he embodied grow quiet along with him. The blades are sheathed, the ring of watchers has dispersed. The last hope of a cruel house has closed, and with it a great and weary contest has finally ended, and there is a deep stillness where before there was only striving. Let that stillness reach you now, wherever you are lying in the soft dark, and let the striving of your own day settle and cease along with the striving of these long-dead houses, and let the quiet carry you gently and easily down into sleep. We come now to the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the great architect of all the sorrow we have walked among, the man whose scheming brought down House Atreides and set in motion so many of the endings we have gathered here. His is a large ending, fitting for so large a presence, and yet the manner of it is one of the strangest and quietest turns in the whole long tale. For the man who broke the unbreakable was himself undone by the smallest and least expected hand of all. Let us settle in softly to consider it, breathing slow, for even the end of so heavy a life may be held gently in the calm before sleep. The Baron was the mind behind the fall. It was he who had woven the long trap that snared the Atreides, he who had turned the good doctor to treason by seizing the man's beloved wife, he who had brought his soldiers and his cruelty down upon Arrakis in the night that shattered a noble house. He was vast in body, kept aloft by suspensor devices that eased the great weight he carried, and vast too in cunning. A patient and pitiless planner who delighted in the ruin of his enemies. Through the earlier chapters of this saga, his shadow falls across almost everything. The hidden hand behind the poisoned tooth of Duke Leto, the hidden hand behind the doctor's grief, the hidden hand behind so much of the suffering that followed. He believed himself the great mover of events, the one who saw further and struck harder than anyone else upon the board. And for a long while, it seemed that he was right, for his scheme succeeded beyond even his own hopes. The Atreides were broken. The Duke was dead. The desert world was in his family's grip, and the future he imagined stretched out before him like a road he alone had built. He set his brutish nephew Robin to squeeze Arrakis dry, and he groomed his polished nephew Feyd-Rautha to charm and to kill his way toward the imperial throne. And he schemed and waited and savored the slow ripening of his designs. He was a man who had gambled greatly and won greatly, and he carried himself with the ease of one who believes the world has finally arranged itself according to his will. But the Baron, for all his cunning, could not see everything, and there was one thread in the weave he never suspected, one small consequence of his own cruelty that would in time reach back to find him. When his soldiers fell upon the Atreides, they did not capture the Lady Jessica, the Duke's beloved, who escaped with her son Paul into the desert. And Jessica carried within her, in those days, a child not yet born, a daughter conceived before the fall. That daughter would be Aaliyah, and her story is one of the most unusual in all this saga, for she came into her awareness before she ever drew breath in the open air. For while she was still in her mother's body, the Lady Jessica underwent a great and dangerous transformation among the Fremen, taking into herself the sacred and perilous substance of that people. And in doing so, she awakened not only her own inner depths, but the depths of the child she carried. The unborn Aaliyah woke within the womb, gaining the memories and the awareness of countless ancestors who lived on within her blood, and among all those crowding inner presences was one in particular. For she carried within her the very awareness of the Baron Harkonnen himself, her own grandfather, whose line ran through her mother's hidden heritage. She was born already knowing, a small child with the mind of ages, and she was, though the Baron never dreamed it, his own granddaughter, a grandchild he had never known existed. Think of the strange justice folded into that. The Baron had built his whole life upon the breaking of House Atreides, and yet, through the very woman he had failed to capture, through the bloodline he had never troubled to trace, a child of his own descent was growing up among the Fremen. A child who carried his own inner voice and who would one day stand before him. He who prided himself on seeing every angle had missed the one that mattered most. The small life quickening in the desert, the least and youngest member of the house he thought he had destroyed. All his cunning had not shown him this. All his planning had left this single thread untied. And so, we come to the day of reckoning, the great turning upon Arrakis, when the Fremen rose and the Harkonnens were broken, and the whole edifice of the Baron's triumph came crashing down. In the confusion and the collapse, amid the fall of everything he had built, the Baron found himself in the presence of the child Alia. This little girl, born of the desert, with the awareness of ancients behind her calm eyes. He did not understand what she was. He saw perhaps only a child, small and strange. And he could not have imagined that within that small frame lived a mind that knew him utterly, that carried his own presence, that had grown up with the knowledge of who he was and what he had done. Alia carried a tiny weapon, a poisoned needle of the kind the great houses knew well, a small and quiet instrument of death. And with that small hand and that small blade, she brought the great Baron down. The vast schemer, the architect of the fall, the man who had toppled a noble house and thought himself the master of the age, was ended by the least and youngest of the family he had sought to destroy, a little girl he had never met and never suspected, his own unknown grandchild. It was a quiet death, for so loud a life, sudden and strange, the great weight of him brought low by the lightest touch imaginable. There is a deep and quiet lesson in the shape of it, and we may hold it softly as we lie here in the dark. The Baron had trusted in his size and his cunning and his ruthlessness, and none of these saved him. He had watched for great enemies and armed himself against mighty foes, and in the end, his undoing came in the smallest possible form, from the one direction he had never thought to guard. The cruelty he had loosed upon the world returned to him at last through a child born of the very suffering he had caused, and the man who broke the unbreakable was himself broken by a hand no larger than a flower. So often it is the overlooked and the underestimated that carry the final word, and so often the mighty are undone not by other mighty things, but by the small truths they were too proud to see. Let us not linger in triumph over his fall, for triumph too is a weight, and we are here to lay our weights aside. It is enough to see the great pattern close. The vast schemer gathered at last into the same stillness that takes the humblest soul, the loud life fallen quiet, the heavy presence lifted away. Even the largest ambition comes at length to its ending. Even the proudest planner is finally surprised. Even the greatest weight is set down in the end, and the world grows peaceful without it. There is a kind of rest in that, the rest that comes when a long and troubling storm has finally blown itself out. So let the Baron be still now, and let the great shadow he cast across so much of this tale lift and thin and vanish into the calm. The schemes are ended. The heavy weight is gone. The small hand has closed the account, and a deep quiet has come, where before there was only striving and cruelty and fear. Let that quiet settle over you as well, easing the last of the day out of you breath by slow breath, and let the gentle stillness that follows every storm carry you softly and easily down into sleep. Let us come now to Shaddam IV, the Padishah Emperor, whose ending is unlike any other we have walked among. For his was not a death of the body at all, but a death of station, the quiet unmaking of a ruler who kept his life yet lost everything that had made him what he was. There is a particular gentleness we can bring to this passing, for no blood closes it, only the slow settling of a great fall, and we may sit beside it softly in the calm before sleep, and watch a long dynasty lay itself down. Breathe slowly now, and let the grandeur of empires grow small and far away. Shaddam IV ruled over the known worlds as the head of an imperial house that had held the throne for many long generations. His was a power that stretched across the whole vast tapestry of settled space, a rule so old and so seemingly fixed that few could imagine any other order of things. He sat at the summit of a great and ancient structure of noble houses and guilds and hidden powers, and he balanced them one against another with the practiced hand of a man born to the task. At his command stood the Sardaukar, the fearsome soldiers of the imperial world, warriors trained in a place so harsh that it forged them into fighters believed to be beyond any equal, the terror and the guarantee of the imperial peace. It was Shaddam who had set the whole tragedy of the Atreides in motion, though he worked through others and kept his own hand hidden. He had grown wary of Duke Leto, whose honor and whose growing esteem among the great houses made the emperor uneasy, for a ruler who trusts in fear is always troubled by those who are loved. And so Shaddam had lent his secret aid to the Harkonnens, giving over even some of his own dreaded Sardaukar, disguised, to help bring the Atreides down upon Arrakis. He believed he was removing a quiet threat, tidying the board, preserving the long balance that kept his line upon the throne. He did not perceive that in striking at the Atreides, he had planted the seed of his own undoing, for the boy who escaped that night would grow into the one power his empire could not withstand. For while the emperor sat secure upon his throne, the desert world he had used as the stage for his scheming was quietly becoming the place where his power would break. Paul had gone to the Fremen, and among them he had risen, and the hardy people of the deep sand were being forged into a force such as the galaxy had never seen. The Sardaukar were feared as the finest soldiers alive, and yet they had been shaped by one harsh world, while the Fremen had been shaped by a world harsher still. And in the crucible of Arrakis, a people even tougher than the Emperor's own troops had come quietly into being. Shaddam did not know this. He measured his strength by old accounts, and the old accounts were about to fail him. When at last the troubles upon Arrakis grew too great to ignore, the Emperor came to the desert world himself, bringing his court and his legions, confident that his presence and his soldiers would settle the matter as they had settled so many others. He arranged his great encampment upon the sands, a vast and glittering assembly of imperial might, and he believed he had come to restore order to a rebellious province. He had come, in truth, to witness the ending of his own reign, though he could not yet see it, and the assembled houses who watched from afar would soon see it with him. The reckoning came in a single overwhelming turn. Muad'Dib led the Fremen out of the deep desert in a great storm, and with them came the mighty worms of Arrakis, ridden into battle, and the young leader loosed as well a power that struck at the very heart of the imperial position. The Sardaukar, those soldiers thought to be beyond any equal, met the Fremen upon the sand and were broken, scattered by fighters harder and fiercer than themselves, and the terror that had upheld the throne for generations dissolved in the space of a single day. The Emperor watched from within his own encampment as the foundation of his power crumbled, as the unbeatable were beaten and the invincible were overrun, and there was nothing left for him to command that could turn the tide. And so Shaddam IV was brought low, not slain, but utterly defeated, stripped of the strength that had made him emperor, while his heart still beat within him. He stood at last as a captive of the young man whose family he had tried to destroy, his soldiers broken, his power gone. His long dynasty ended before the eyes of the great houses he had once commanded. Paul took the throne through the twin instruments of marriage and threat, binding himself by wedding to the imperial line and holding over the whole assembled order a power so terrible that none dared refuse him. The old emperor had no cards left to play. The balance he had tended all his life had tipped completely, and the summit he had stood upon for so long simply was no longer his. He was sent into exile, borne away from the center of power to a quiet prison world, a place of retirement far from the throne and the court and the great turning of events. There he would live out his remaining days, no longer Padishah emperor, no longer the ruler of the known worlds, only a man who had once held everything and now held nothing but the memory of it. This is what we mean when we call his an ending of station rather than of body. For the man went on living while the emperor died, and the dynasty that had ruled for so many long generations closed its long chapter and passed quietly into the past. There is a soft and thoughtful sorrow in an ending like this, gentler in some ways than the deaths that spill blood, and yet carrying its own kind of loss. To lose the thing that has defined you for a lifetime, to keep your breath but surrender your name and your place and your purpose, is a passing of its own, a small death folded inside a continuing life. Shaddam had been the summit of an ancient order, and now he was a private man upon a distant world, and the great machine of empire turned on without him, as though he had never sat at its heart. All the long generations of his line came to rest in him, and with his quiet exile, the story of that dynasty was gently closed. Let us hold him kindly, this fallen emperor, for pride brought low is a human thing, and there is no cruelty in watching a great height come gently down to the level ground where the rest of us stand. He had trusted in fear and in soldiers and in the long fixed order of things, and all of it slipped from him, and in the end he was left with only himself, which is what each of us is left with at the last. The throne passed on. The dynasty ended. The great weight of ruling the worlds was lifted from his shoulders forever, whether he wished it lifted or not, and in that final unburdening there was, perhaps, a strange and unlooked-for peace. So let the old emperor rest now in his quiet exile, and let the long reign of his house settle softly into the past, where all reigns eventually go. The soldiers are scattered. The throne has changed hands. The great balance has tipped and come to rest, and a long and ancient chapter has closed as gently as a book laid down at the end of the day. Let that same settling move through you now, letting go of every burden the day has laid upon your own shoulders, and let the quiet that follows the end of all striving carry you softly and easily down into sleep. Now we come to a man whose name will follow us far into the ages ahead, farther than any other name in all this long tale, and we come to him first as he was in the beginning, a living man of flesh and warmth and quick laughter, before death touched him even once. His name was Duncan Idaho, and he was the swordmaster of House Atreides, one of the finest blades ever to serve that ancient family. He had come with the Atreides out of the ocean world of Caladan to the burning sands of Arrakis, and he loved the young heir Paul as if the boy were his own kin, teaching him the ways of the blade with patience and with pride, taking joy in each small thing the boy learned to do well. Let yourself picture this man as he was in his good days, easy in his strength, sure of his hands, a fighter who carried his skill lightly and never cruelly. He had walked among the Fremen in the deep desert as an envoy of his duke, and he had come to admire them greatly, their toughness and their quiet courage and the strange, fierce dignity of a people who had made a home out of a world that wished them dead. He had learned something of their ways and earned something of their trust, and in the days to come that trust would matter more than anyone could yet have known. He was, in every sense, a bridge between the house he served and the desert that would one day rise. Then came the night of the fall, the night the great betrayal opened the gates of the Atreides stronghold to their enemies. The Harkonnens poured in with the soldiers of the Emperor hidden among them, and the household that had seemed so strong was broken open in the space of a few dark hours. In the confusion and the ruin of that night, Paul and his mother Jessica were cast out into peril, hunted across the sands, carried at last by chance and by the plans of others toward the open desert where their only hope of living lay. And it was Duncan Idaho who stood between them and the death that pursued them. He gathered the boy and his mother and brought them through danger after danger toward a lonely research station out in the wastes, a small refuge where a handful of loyal people still drew breath. But the enemy was close behind, and the Sardaukar, the terrible soldier fanatics of the Emperor, came upon that refuge in force. There were far too many of them, and far too few defenders, and Duncan understood in a single clear moment what the night now asked of him. He understood that the boy who carried the future of the house could not be allowed to fall, and that the only coin left to spend for the boy's escape was his own life. So he chose to spend it. He set himself in the narrow place where the enemy must come, and he held that place with everything he had, blade against blade, one man against many, buying with each passing breath a little more time for Paul and Jessica to slip away into the safety of the deep sand. He fought the way he had lived, without panic and without hatred, simply doing the last and hardest task that loyalty had ever set before him. He did not fight to win, for winning was no longer possible. He fought to hold the door a little longer, and then a little longer still, and every heartbeat he stole from the enemy was a gift laid quietly at the feet of the boy he loved. There is a great gentleness in the way this death should be remembered, for it was not a death of despair. Duncan did not fall because he was overwhelmed by fear or broken by his enemies. He fell because he had decided, freely and with his whole heart, that the life of the boy was worth more than his own, and that he would rather end here, defending, than live 1 hour longer, having let the boy die. When many blades are set against a single one, there can be only one ending, and that ending came for him at last, quietly closing a life that had been spent to the very edge of its usefulness and beyond. He gave all of it, and he kept nothing back. And because he held that door, Paul and Jessica lived. They passed out of the reach of their hunters and into the vast and secret keeping of the desert, and there the whole later course of the saga was allowed to begin. Everything that Paul would one day become, every turning of the long story that spirals out across the centuries, rests in some quiet way upon the few minutes that one swordmaster bought with his body on the worst night his house had ever known. It is a small thing and an enormous thing at once, the way a single act of loyalty can hold open the door to an entire future. Those who survived carried the memory of him like a warm coal held close against the cold. Paul would think of him again and again in the years to come, at moments of danger and at moments of grief, remembering the hands that had taught him and the loyalty that had died for him. Among the Fremen who came to follow Paul, the name of Duncan Idaho was spoken with honor, for they too had known him and known his worth, and they understood better than most what it means to lay down a life so that others might cross the sand alive. His death became a kind of quiet cornerstone, a thing the survivors stood upon without always knowing they did. And here is the strange, soft wonder that waits at the edge of this ending. Though we will not follow it tonight, only touch it lightly before we let it go. This death, which seemed so final on that dark night, would not be the last of Duncan Idaho. His story was not truly finished when his heart grew still in that lonely station in the sand. But that is a thread for another quiet hour, And for now, it is enough simply to know that the loyalty running through this man was of a kind so deep that even death would find it difficult to keep. So let us leave him gently where he chose to make his stand, having done the one great thing that was asked of him, and done it fully and without regret. Let us hold him not as a man cut down, but as a man who gave himself away on purpose, so that a boy and his mother might live to see the morning. There is no horror to sit with here, only the clean and settled peace of a task completed by someone who loved enough to finish it. The door he held has long since closed, and those he saved have long since passed on themselves, and the sand has covered over the place where he fell many times over. Let your breathing slow now, and let the weight of that night dissolve into the soft dark around you. Feel how a single act of faithfulness can reach forward across all the years and hold open a future for people never met and never known. There is comfort in that, a deep and quiet comfort, the sense that nothing given so freely is ever truly wasted. Let that comfort settle over you like a warm blanket drawn up in the night. There is nothing you need to carry from this, and nothing you need to fear, only the gentle knowledge that loyalty outlasts the body that offered it. Let yourself grow heavy and still, and let the memory of the swordmaster fade softly into rest as the desert wind smooths the last of his footprints from the cooling sand. We left the swordmaster Duncan, Idaho, where he chose to fall, holding open a door with his own body so that a boy and his mother might live. Yet his story did not end in that lonely station in the sand. And tonight, we follow the strange and gentle wonder of what came after. The many quiet returns of a man death could not seem to keep, for there were, in the far and secret corners of that empire, a people called the Tleilaxu, keepers of forbidden arts, who had learned to grow a body anew from the dead flesh of one who had passed. Such a body they called a Gola, a life returned out of death, and it was a Gola of Duncan, Idaho, that they made. Let yourself imagine the strangeness of it softly, without alarm. For there is nothing frightening here, only something deep and tender to sit beside. Out of what remained of the swordmaster who had died defending Paul, these hidden artisans grew a new man, whole and living and young, wearing the face and the frame of the one who had gone. They did not, at first, give him back his old memories. They gave him instead a new name, calling him Hate, and they sent him as a gift and as a subtle weapon to the very court of Paul, who was by then the Emperor Muad'Dib, ruler of a vast and trembling empire. Picture the sorrow and the wonder of that meeting, when a man believed long dead walked once more into the presence of the boy he had died to save, now grown into a burdened emperor. Here was the beloved face, unchanged, alive, and yet a stranger. A man who did not remember teaching a boy the blade, who did not remember the night of the fall, who did not remember his own great loyalty or his own great death. It was a gift wrapped around a wound, and it stirred in Paul both a bottomless joy and a bottomless grief, to see the friend returned, and yet not truly returned, present in body and absent in the memory that had made him who he was. And here is the quiet miracle at the heart of the Gola of Duncan, Idaho, the thing that would echo across all the long ages to come. For within this new man, made without his old memories, those very memories were not truly gone. They lay buried somewhere beneath the surface of him, and under the pressure of great feeling and great crisis they broke through at last. And the man called Hate remembered that he had once been Duncan, Idaho. In a single overwhelming moment, the two lives fused into one, the old and the new, the man who had died and the man who had been made, and he became himself again, whole and remembering, the loyal swordmaster restored across the gulf of death itself. This first return would not be the last. Across the long centuries that unfold beyond the days of Paul, Duncan, Idaho was grown again and again. Life after life. Each Gola, a new man, wearing the old face. Each one living for a time and then reaching his own quiet ending. And then in time being made anew once more. He served the children of Paul, and he served their children in turn. And he served the great long reign of Leto II across the thousands of years of that strange and lonely rule. He was reborn into ages that had forgotten the empire he first knew, into a galaxy so changed that the world of his first life had become little more than a legend. Consider for a moment the strange loneliness that must have lived at the heart of such a fate. And yet consider, too, the quiet blessing folded within it. Each time he woke into a new life, the people he had known and loved were long since gone, worn away by the passing of ages, remembered only in old records or not remembered at all. He woke each time a stranger to the world, the last living trace of a house and a time that had faded into deep antiquity. And still, in each of these lives, he found in himself the same steadiness, the same readiness to serve and to care, so that even in a galaxy that had forgotten everything he came from, he brought with him the warmth of a loyalty older than any living memory. He carried the past forward in his own person, gently, faithfully, without bitterness at all he had lost. Think gently on what it must have meant to live in this way, to die and to return, over and over, always the same man in his heart, and always waking into a world made strange around him. Each of his lives had its own beginning and its own close, its own small joys and its own losses, and each of his deaths was a real ending, mourned in its own time before the next return came. He was not spared the sorrow of dying. He simply carried it more times than any other soul in all the saga, laying down life after life across an expanse of years so vast that no ordinary heart could hold it. Yet what is most tender in all of this is not the strangeness of the returns, but the thread of constancy that ran through every one of them. In every life, no matter the age into which he woke, no matter how much time had swallowed the world he first knew, Duncan, Idaho was loyal. He was, again and again, the same faithful man, quick and warm and true, forever bound to the memory of the house he had first served and the boy he had first loved. It was as though the universe kept bringing back this one particular soul because it needed, in every age, at least one being who would simply be steadfast, one heart that would not turn, one blade that would fall only in someone else's defense. And so his many deaths, laid end to end across the ages, became something more than a string of endings. They became a thread of memory binding the whole vast saga together, a single continuous loyalty stretched across thousands upon thousands of years. Every other person we have walked among died once and was gone. Duncan, Idaho died and returned, and died and returned, until his very name came to mean the thing that endures, the faithfulness that time cannot wear away and death cannot finish. In a story so full of change and loss, he became the one familiar face that kept coming home. There is a great and quiet comfort to be drawn from this, if you let it settle over you softly. We tend to think of death as the door that closes for good, the final full stop at the end of a life. And in the ordinary way of things it is. Yet here, in this one gentle strand of the tale, we are given a picture of a loyalty so deep that it kept finding its way back into the world, again and again, refusing to be the last word. It is only a story, of course, only a beautiful invention, and yet the feeling it leaves behind is true. The feeling that the best things in a person The love and the faithfulness and the warmth are somehow larger than any single ending. So let us hold the many deaths of Duncan, Idaho all together now, gathered in one quiet handful, and let us not grieve them one by one. Let us instead feel the long, unbroken loyalty that ran beneath them all. The same true heart waking again and again across the ages, always coming back to serve and to protect. There is no horror in this passing, and no fear, only the soft astonishment of a devotion that would not stay in the grave. Let that astonishment turn slowly into peace within you. Feel your body grow heavy and warm, and let the thousands of years fold quietly closed like a book set gently aside. There is nothing here you need to hold, and nothing you need to fear. Only rest in the gentle thought that faithfulness can outlast even death itself, returning as softly and as surely as morning returns to the desert after the longest night. Let that thought carry you downward now, slow and unhurried, into deep and easy sleep. Now we come to a passing of a most unusual kind, for it is the death of something within a man who goes on living, a closing that takes place behind the eyes rather than in the stilling of the heart. We come to Paul Atreides in the years of his power, when he had become the Emperor Muad'Dib and ruled from a great city raised upon the sands of Arrakis, a man surrounded by devotion and by dread, carrying a weight of vision that no other soul could share. And we come to the day the light was taken from his eyes. Let yourself first picture the man as he was in those days, no longer the frightened boy fleeing across the desert, but a ruler grown vast in influence and terribly alone at the center of it. His power had swept out across the known worlds, and armies marched in his name, and yet within himself he carried a burden heavier than any throne, for he could see the shapes of things to come. The many branching paths of the future spread before his inner sight like dunes rolling to a far horizon. He had walked among those futures so long that he sometimes could not tell the coming days from the present hour, and this strange gift of foresight was as much a prison as it was a power. Into this life came a hidden attack, born of the many enemies who could not strike him openly, and so struck at him in secret. There were those who plotted against him even within the shelter of his own city, and among the tools of their conspiracy was a forbidden weapon of terrible and ancient making, a device called a stone burner. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a thing outlawed by old and solemn agreement across the great houses, for it burned with a radiance that could reach out and destroy the eyes of everyone within its range, a cruel and indiscriminate fire meant to blind rather than to slay outright. The stone burner was set within the city, and when it was loosed, its dreadful light spilled out across the streets, and many who stood nearby lost their sight in that single terrible flare. Paul was caught within its reach, and the radiance found his eyes, and when it had passed, the light of the world was gone from him. The organs of his sight were destroyed utterly, burned away past any healing, and by every ordinary measure he was now a blind man, cast into a darkness from which no physician could ever draw him back. It was a grievous wound, and it fell upon the most powerful man in all the empire. And here is the strange and quiet wonder that turns this from a tale of horror into something gentler and stranger. For though the eyes of Paul were destroyed, he did not walk as a blind man walks. His long years of foresight had given him another way of seeing entirely, an inner vision that ran along the threads of the future so precisely that he knew, moment by moment, exactly what lay before him. He knew where each person stood, and what each would do, and where his own feet would fall, all of it laid out in the vision that unfolded within his mind. And so he moved through his ruined city as though he could still see it, walking without stumbling, turning to face those who spoke, reaching for things unerringly. A blind man who seemed to miss nothing at all. To those around him, it was a marvel and a mystery. This emperor, who had lost his eyes and yet saw everything, who could describe the color of the sky he could no longer look upon, and name the faces he could no longer behold. By the old and hard law of the Fremen, a blind man was meant to be given over to the desert, for the tribe could not carry those who could not fend for themselves. Yet Paul was plainly not helpless. He walked, he ruled, he saw by the strange light within, and so the law that would have sent him into the sand could find no hold upon him, for he did not fit the shape of the blindness it was made to answer. And yet, for all the wonder of it, this was a death of a kind, and it is right to sit beside it as we have sat beside the others. The eyes of Paul had died, and with them a whole way of being in the world was lost to him forever. Never again would he look upon the face of the woman he loved, or watch his children with his own sight, or see the desert sunrise spread its long gold across the dunes. The ordinary living light that every person takes for granted, the simple gift of opening the eyes upon the morning, was taken from him and did not return. Something in him had closed that could not be opened again, and he carried that quiet loss beneath all his outward composure. More than this, the loss of his eyes drew him ever more tightly into the trap of his own foresight. For now, he could see the world only through the vision that ran along the future, and to lose that vision even for a moment would be to fall into a true and total darkness. He became bound to the path he had already foreseen, unable to step aside from it without losing the only sight he had left. The blinding, cruel as it was, pulled him closer to the ending that already waited for him out in the deep desert, the quiet release that lay somewhere ahead along the thread he was compelled to follow. In losing his eyes, he had taken one more step along the road toward giving himself to the sand. There is a deep and gentle sorrow in this, the sorrow of a man who could see everything and yet was permitted to see nothing freely, whose inner sight was both his salvation and his cage. He bore it, as he bore so much, without complaint and without any outward breaking, moving through his days with a stillness that those around him mistook for serenity. But within, he was walking a narrowing path, and the loss of the light of his eyes was one of the last narrowings before the end. It is worth pausing to feel how strange and how tender it is that a man could lose his eyes and yet gain, in exchange, a way of moving through the world that seemed almost like grace. Where another might have stumbled and groped in fear, Paul walked with a calm and flowing certainty, his steps guided by a sight that lived entirely behind the ruin of his eyes. And yet, this was no true gift, for it left him no freedom, only the single foreseen road he was bound to follow. To see everything and to be able to change nothing is a lonely kind of vision, and he carried that loneliness quietly beneath the marvel that others saw. The wonder was real, and so was the cost, and the two were woven together so tightly that neither could be felt without the other. So let us hold this strange passing softly, the death of the eyes within a living man, and let us not recoil from it. There is no gore here to trouble the quiet of the night, only the tender ache of something precious lost, and the quiet marvel of a soul that found another way to see when the ordinary way was taken from it. Let us honor both the loss and the strange grace that carried him through it, the way a candle, even as its outer flame is snuffed, may leave a lingering warmth in the room. Feel now how your own eyes wish to close, softly and without effort, and let them close. There is a gentleness in the coming of darkness when it is chosen and welcomed, the darkness of rest rather than the darkness of loss. Let the light of the day dim slowly around you, and let the quiet gather close. There is nothing more you need to look upon tonight, and nothing you must watch for, and nothing you must guard against. Only let your sight rest, and your mind grow still, and your breathing slow, and let yourself drift downward into the soft and healing dark, where the eyes may rest and the heart may finally be at peace. Now we come to one of the deepest sorrows in all the long saga, a passing so tender that even a man who ruled the stars could not turn it aside. We come to Chani, the Fremen woman who was the beloved of Paul, the one he loved most freely and most truly in all his crowded and burdened life. And we come to the quiet ending that took her as she gave the gift of new life into the world. Let yourself first hold her in mind as she truly was, apart from any sorrow, for she deserves to be seen in her own light before we sit beside her leaving. Chani was a daughter of the desert, born to the harsh and beautiful ways of the Fremen, quick and fierce and gentle all at once. She had walked the sands since childhood. She had known the hardness of that world and answered it with a hardness of her own. And beneath that strength there ran a deep and steady warmth. When she and Paul came together, she became for him the one true and simple joy in a life that grew ever more complicated and ever more heavy. Among all the demands of empire and vision and prophecy, she was the one thing he had chosen purely for love, the one bond untangled from politics and power. She stood beside him through the long rise of his fortunes, through the desert war and the taking of the throne, and the strange, lonely years of his rule. When he took a princess to wife for the sake of the empire, it was Chani who remained the wife of his heart, the one he turned to in the quiet hours, the mother of his children, the still center of his private world. She asked for no crown and no station, only to be beside him, and in that closeness she gave him the nearest thing to peace that his foreseen and burdened life would ever allow. To understand the depth of the sorrow that comes now, one must first understand the depth of what she was to him. For the greater the love, the greater the grief when it is taken. In time she came to carry his children, and here the sorrow gathers, soft and slow. For Paul, with his terrible gift of foresight, had already seen what was coming. He had walked the branching paths of the future and had glimpsed, among them, the passing of Chani, and he knew that the very children she carried, precious as they were, would come into the world at the cost of her life. He carried this knowledge alone, unable to share its full weight, unable to change what he had seen. To love someone completely, and to know the day and the manner of their leaving, and to be powerless to turn it aside, is a particular and cruel kind of suffering, and it was his to bear in silence through the months of her carrying. When at last her time came, she gave birth not to one child but to two, the twins Leto and Ghanima, a son and a daughter who would carry the line of the Atreides forward into ages Paul himself would never see. The birth was hard, as such births can be, and it drew from her more strength than her body could spare. In the giving of these two new lives, her own life quietly ran out. She did not die in violence or in fear, but in the oldest and most human of ways, spending herself utterly so that her children might begin. She gave everything she had, and in the giving she was emptied, and she slipped away, even as her children drew their first breaths. There is a great tenderness in the shape of this passing, painful as it is, for it was a death woven inseparably into the beginning of new life. In the same hour that the world lost Chani, it received Leto and Ghanima, the twins who would matter so greatly to all that followed. Her ending and their beginning were bound together as tightly as breath and body, so that even in the depth of the grief, there was something being given, rather than only something being lost. She poured her life directly into the two small lives she left behind, and in them, in a quiet and literal way, she went on. Think, if you will, of how the desert people themselves understood such things, for they had long known that no drop of water and no measure of life is ever truly wasted upon the sand. To them, all that a person was flowed onward into those who came after, gathered up and carried forward rather than simply lost. Chani had been shaped by that wisdom from her earliest childhood, and it is fitting that her own ending should have taken this shape, her strength passing directly and without waste into her children. She did not vanish so much as she was poured onward, the way water is poured from one vessel into the next, losing nothing of itself in the passage. Her son and her daughter carried her within them from their very first breath, and through them she reached forward into ages she would never herself see. And yet, for Paul, the loss was very nearly more than even he could bear. He had foreseen it, and still it broke something in him that no throne and no power could ever mend. The woman he had loved most freely, the one bright, uncomplicated joy of his shadowed life, was gone, and he had known she would go, and had been unable to save her. All the vast reach of his empire, all the armies that marched at his word, all the strange foresight that let him walk blind as though he could see, none of it could give him back the one person he most wished to keep. The man who ruled the stars was, in the end, as helpless before the loss of his beloved as the humblest soul who ever grieved. Her passing hollowed him. It emptied out the private center that had held him together through his years of rule, and it removed the last soft tether that bound him to the wish to go on living as an emperor and a god to his people. With Chani gone, much of what had kept Paul in the world was gone as well, and the quiet ending that already waited for him out in the desert began to seem less like a thing to dread and more like a release he could welcome. Her death and his own drawing away into the sand are bound together, the one leading gently toward the other, so that in losing her, he began also to loosen his own hold upon the life he had built. So let us sit beside Chani now, and let us grieve her softly, as she deserves to be grieved. And then, let us set the grief down gently, as she herself might have wished. Hers was not a wasted death, nor a cruel one, but a giving over of self so that new life might come, the oldest and most sacred of exchanges. She left behind 2 children who carried her forward, and a love so deep that its loss reshaped the course of an empire. Few are mourned so completely, and few give so much in their leaving. Feel now how the sorrow can soften as you breathe, how even the deepest grief grows quiet in time and settles into something more like tenderness than pain. There is comfort in remembering that she went in the act of giving, that her last strength became the first breath of her children, that nothing she was ever truly ended but only passed onward into those who came after. Let that comfort spread slowly through you, warm and easing. Let your body grow heavy and still, and let the sadness loosen its hold, breath by breath. As the desert night grows cool and calm around you, there is nothing you must carry from this, and nothing you must fix, only the quiet knowledge that love given fully is never wasted, even when it costs everything. Let that knowledge cradle you now, and let your thoughts slow, and let yourself drift down, gentle and unhurried, into deep and restful sleep. Now we come to the passing of the man who has walked at the center of so much of this long tale, the boy who fled across the sand and became the emperor of the known worlds. And we come to him at the end of his road, blind and grieving, choosing at last to lay his great burden down. We come to the day that Paul Atreides walked alone into the deep desert and gave himself to the sand. Let yourself hold him now as he was in those final days, no longer the frightened youth and no longer the rising conqueror, but a weary man who had carried more than any single soul was ever meant to carry. His eyes had been taken from him by the cruel light of a forbidden weapon, and though his inner vision let him move as though he still could see, he lived within a narrowing darkness. The woman he had loved most freely, Chani, had passed from the world in the giving of their children, and her loss had hollowed the private center that once held him together. And all around him had grown a vast and fervent worship, a religion raised upon his name, a movement that had swept across the stars in his wake and shed rivers of blood in his honor, a thing he had foreseen and dreaded and yet could not stop. For Paul had become a god to countless people, and there is perhaps no heavier weight a person can bear than the worship of multitudes. Every word he spoke was taken as scripture, every gesture as prophecy, and the man himself was slowly vanishing behind the vast idol his followers had made of him. He could feel himself becoming a symbol rather than a person, a fixed and frozen thing around which armies and empires turned, and he knew, with the terrible clarity of his foresight, that if he lingered on, he would harden further into that idol, a fading god propped upon a throne, ruling by the momentum of a worship he had come to fear. To remain would be to let the man he still was dissolve entirely into the myth. And so he made his choice, quietly and without any grand declaration, according to the oldest custom of the desert people who had taken him in so long ago. Among the Fremen there was a way for those who could no longer serve the tribe to take their leave with dignity, walking out alone into the deep sand to give themselves back to the desert that had given them everything. It was not seen as a defeat or a shame, but as a natural and honorable ending, a returning of the self to the vast and holy wasteland. By the strict old law, a blind man was meant to be given to the desert in this way. And though Paul had escaped that law for a time by the strange grace of his inner sight, he now embraced it freely, choosing for himself the ending he could have refused. Picture him then, on that last quiet day, setting down everything he had gathered to himself across his crowded years. He set down the throne, that vast seat of power from which he had ruled the worlds. He set down his name, the name Muad'Dib that had become a banner and a battle cry across the stars. He set down the great religion and the endless demands of empire, and he set down even his two small children, Leto and Ghanima, leaving them behind to grow into whatever the future held, trusting them to the care of others and to the turning of the years. One by one, he released the things that had bound him, until there was nothing left to hold him in the world of thrones and worship. And then he simply walked away, out past the edges of the city and into the open dunes, a lone blind figure moving into the immensity of the sand. He did not go as a broken man driven out, but as a soul walking freely toward the release he had chosen. The desert that had first taken him in as a hunted boy now opened to receive him one last time, and he passed into it and was gone, swallowed by the vast and patient wasteland, leaving behind him only footprints that the wind would soon smooth away. No one followed, and no one could have called him back, for he had chosen this with the whole of his remaining will. There is something quietly beautiful in the completeness of his letting go, the way he loosened his grip upon each thing in turn until his hands were finally empty. Most of us cling to what we have gathered, holding tight to our names and our roles and the small kingdoms we build around ourselves, unable to imagine setting them down. Paul, at the end, set down more than almost any person ever has. An entire empire and a religion and a throne that ruled the stars. And he did it without bitterness and without a backward glance. He had seen too far and carried too much to want any of it any longer. And in releasing it, he found that there was nothing fearful in the letting go, only a great and spreading quiet, like the hush that settles over the dunes when the wind at last dies down. It is fitting, and it is gentle, to understand that this was not truly a defeat, but a release. All through his life, Paul had been carried along by forces larger than himself, by prophecy and by foresight, and by the vast movement that had risen in his name, borne forward on a current he could see, but could not turn. To walk into the desert was, at the very last, to reclaim the one thing that had so often been taken from him: the freedom to choose his own ending. He was not conquered, and he was not cast down. He chose the manner and the moment of his own quiet leaving, and in that choosing there was a dignity and a peace he had not known in many long years. There is a deep softness in the picture of it, a man laying down an unbearable weight and walking unburdened into the openness at last. He had carried the future of his house, the grief of his lost beloved, the darkness behind his ruined eyes, and the crushing worship of half the galaxy, and now, one by one, he had let every part of it slip from his hands. What remained, as he walked into the dunes, was only himself, stripped of throne and name and role, a single soul returning to the great quiet from which all things come. Whatever became of him out there in the sand, he had already found the thing he most needed, which was release. And so let us leave Paul Atreides where he chose to go, out among the endless dunes beneath the wide desert sky, and let us not grieve him as one lost, but honor him as one set free. He had walked the longest and heaviest road of anyone in this tale, and he ended it not with a cry, but with a quiet stepping away, giving himself gently back to the world that had made him. There is no horror in this ending, and nothing to fear within it, only the calm of a burden finally laid down, and a soul finally at rest. Feel now how good it is to let a heavy thing be set aside, how the shoulders loosen and the breath comes easier when there is nothing left to carry. Let yourself set down, one by one, the small weights of your own day, the cares and the tasks and the worries, releasing each of them softly into the dark as Paul released the throne and the name and all the rest. There is nothing you must hold on to tonight, and nowhere you must go, and nothing you must be for anyone. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and let the desert quiet gather close around you, vast and gentle and still. Let the last of the day dissolve like footprints smoothed away by a soft night wind. There is only rest now, only the slow rise and fall of your own easy breathing, carrying you downward, gentle and unhurried, into deep and peaceful sleep. Now we come to a passing that asks a special tenderness of us, for it is the ending of a soul who was never allowed a single quiet moment from the very first breath she drew. Her name is Aaliyah, and she was the sister of Paul, born on the sand of Arrakis in the days after the fall of House Atreides. Let yourself settle a little deeper as we sit beside her story, and let your breathing slow. For though her ending is a sorrowful one, we come to it not to be shaken, but to understand a burden that no gentle heart should ever have been asked to carry alone. To understand how she came to her fall, we must go back to the days before she was born, when her mother Jessica drank the sacred and terrible water of life so that she might become a reverend mother among the Fremen. In that moment of change, the awareness of all the mothers who had come before flooded into Jessica, and the unborn child within her woke to that same vast inheritance, while she was still curled in the warm dark, long before she could ever have learned to shield herself. And so, Aaliyah entered the world already knowing far more than any child should know, already carrying within her the memories and the voices of countless ancestors stretching back beyond counting. The Fremen had a word for such a one, a word touched with fear, for they understood how heavy such a gift could become. For a time, in the years of her youth, Aaliyah carried it with a strange and startling grace. She was quick and bright and unafraid, a small figure moving through the great events of the Empire with a knowing far older than her years. She stood at the side of her brother as he rose to power, and she held her own place in the new order that grew up around the throne of Muad'Dib. Yet all the while, within the quiet of her own mind, the voices never truly stilled. They murmured beneath her thoughts like a sea that never sleeps, each ancestor pressing forward with its own memories, its own hungers, its own long and finished life wanting to be lived again through her. The teaching of her mother's order held a grave warning about souls born as Aaliyah was born. Such a one, they said, must take the crowd of inner lives and gather them gently into a kind of inner harmony, letting each ancestor have its place without letting any single one take the reins. It was a delicate and lifelong labor of the spirit, a constant tending, and it was meant to be done with guidance and care. But Aaliyah had come into her awareness too early and too alone, without the slow preparation that the order gave to its grown initiates, and so she was left to hold back that inner tide by her own strength year upon year, with no one who could fully share the weight. As the long years passed, and her brother walked into the desert and was gone, and as she took up the care of his young children and the steadying of the empire in their name, the pressure within her grew. Among all the ancestral voices that clamored for her attention, one at last began to rise above the rest, patient and cunning and endlessly persuasive. It was the voice of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, her own grandfather through the twisting of bloodlines she had never chosen, the very architect of the ruin of her house. He had been dead for many years, undone in his own time by the child that Aaliyah had once been. And yet the pattern of him lived on within her, waiting with the patience of the truly dead for a moment of weakness through which he might reach the light again. Little by little, in ways so gradual that she could not always see them, the old Baron pressed his way forward. He offered her rest from the ceaseless strain. He offered her his counsel, his certainty, his willingness to carry the hard decisions she was too weary to make. And each time she leaned upon him, each time she let his strength stand in for her own failing strength, he grew a little more present, and she grew a little more faint within her own mind. It is one of the quiet sorrows of her story that her fall did not come as a single dramatic surrender, but as a slow yielding across many tired days, the way a shoreline gives way not to one great wave, but to the patient return of the tide. There came a season at last when those who loved her could see that she was no longer wholly herself. Her judgments turned strange and cruel in ways that did not belong to the bright child they remembered. The empire she governed grew troubled beneath her, and her own kin, the twins Leto and Ghanima, whom Paul and Chani had left behind, understood with a grief beyond their years that the aunt who had raised them was being crowded out of her own life by the dead who would not release her. They tried, in their way, to reach her, to call her back to the surface of herself, but the voices within her had grown too loud, and the Baron had grown too strong, and the harmony she had been meant to build had never been given the chance to take root. And so, we come to the moment of her release, and we come to it softly. High in the great keep at Arrakis, in a chamber whose tall windows looked out over the city and the desert beyond, Aaliyah stood at the last upon the very edge of herself. In a final clearing of her own mind, a last surfacing of the true Aaliyah through all the clamor, she found that she could no longer bear to remain a house occupied by the dead, a life lived by voices that were not her own. She would not let the Baron wear her like a garment through all the years that might remain to her. And so, in that one lucid and terribly brave moment, she chose. She turned toward the open window and the wide evening beyond it, and she let herself go, giving her body to the fall so that her spirit might at last be free of the crowd that had claimed it. Let us hold this gently, for there is something in it that is not only sorrow. Her ending was the ending of a captivity. It was the quiet decision of a soul who had been given too much too soon, and who, in the very last, reclaimed the one thing that had always been hers to give, which was the choosing of her own release. She had carried within her the awareness of the barren and of countless ancestors from before her first breath, a gift that was truly a weight, and she carried it as long as any single soul could carry such a thing. That she could not carry it forever is no failing of hers. It is only the measure of how heavy it was. So let her rest now, this bright and haunted child, who never knew a moment of the ordinary quiet that most of us take for granted. Let the voices within her fall silent at last, each ancestor settling back into the long stillness, the old baron loosed from the mind he had haunted, the whole crowded chamber of her spirit growing calm and empty and finally her own again. She gave more of herself to her house and her people than almost anyone in the whole long tale, and she asked for less rest than any of them, and now, at last, the rest has come. Let your own shoulders soften as hers soften. Let the murmur of the day, the many small voices of things undone and things remembered, grow quiet beneath your slowing breath, the way her voices grow quiet now. There is nothing here to hold, nothing here to fear. Only a weary soul set gently down at last, and the wide desert evening drawing its cool blue peace over the keep, and over Arrakis, and over you, as you drift a little further into the soft dark of sleep. Let us breathe together for a moment before we go on, and let the quiet gather close around you. For the passing we come to now is unlike any we have met so far. It is not the falling of a body in battle, nor the fading of a life beneath the open sky. It is a stranger and gentler kind of ending, the willing death of the man a person once was, chosen not out of despair, but out of a love so wide that it reached toward every soul who would ever be born. This is the choice of Leto II, the son of Paul, the child of Chani, and it begins with a vision. To understand what he gave up, we must first understand what he saw. Leto was born as his twin sister Ghanima was born, already awake to the long inheritance of his line. One of those rare souls who carry within them the memories of all the ancestors that came before. From his father Paul, he inherited more than memory alone. He inherited the terrible gift of prescience, the ability to look down the branching paths of time and see the many roads that the future might take. His father had walked out into the desert rather than follow the darkest of those roads to its end. His aunt Alia had been swallowed by the voices within her. But Leto, still a boy in years and yet older than any elder in the deep places of his mind, looked upon the whole spread of what was to come and saw something that no one before him had been willing to truly face. He saw that humanity, left to itself, was drifting toward its own quiet extinction. Not in a single great catastrophe, but through a slow narrowing, a settling into comfort and stillness and dependence. A gathering of all the threads of human life into fewer and fewer hands, until at last some single blow, some plague or famine or folly, might find the whole species gathered in one fragile place and end it altogether. He saw the long dying of a people who had forgotten how to scatter, how to wander, how to survive the loss of any one home. And against that long dying he searched the countless futures for a way through, a road that led not to ending, but to endurance. Among all the branching paths, he found one. It was a single narrow way winding through the dark forest of what might be, so slender and so demanding that almost no eye could even have found it, and no ordinary will could ever have walked it. He came to call it the Golden Path. And it was golden not because it was easy or bright, but because it was the one road that led out the far side, the one thread that reached through all the danger and came at last to a humanity so widely spread, so various and untamed and free, that no single blow could ever again gather it up and end it. To walk that path was to save not this person or that person, not one house or one world, but the whole long future of everyone who would ever live. Yet the path exacted a price so heavy that his father had looked upon it and turned away, unable to pay it. For the Golden Path could not be walked by a man. It asked for a guardian who could live not for a lifetime, but for thousands of years. A patient and unwavering will steady enough to hold humanity to its long lesson across ages beyond counting, gentle enough never to break it, and firm enough never to let it slip back into its comfortable drift toward death. No human body could endure such a span. No human heart could bear such loneliness. And so the path asked Leto for the one thing hardest to give. It asked him to stop being a man. Here we come to the quiet center of his choice, and let us hold it softly, for it is a death though no blood is shed. Out in the deep desert of Arrakis lived the small sand trout, the little creatures that were the young of the great sandworms, soft and living things that gathered water and sealed it away in the deep rock. Leto had learned, in the long knowing of his ancestral memory, that these small creatures could be persuaded to join themselves to living skin, to spread across a human body like a living second skin, sheathing it in a membrane that would lend it strength beyond any man and length of years beyond any reckoning. To take them upon himself was to begin a slow and irreversible change, a merging of the human in the desert, a becoming of something that had never existed before and would never exist again. He did not come to this lightly, and he did not come to it in fear. There was a long and searching passage of his young life in which he wrestled with the choice, wandering the desert, testing the vision again and again to be certain that no gentler road existed, that no lesser sacrifice would serve. He would have given much to find another way. But every path he traced that did not pass through his own transformation ended, sooner or later, in the long dying of his people. And so, in the end, he opened his heart to the certainty of it. And he chose. When at last he pressed the living sand trout to his skin and let them spread across him, he was choosing to let the boy he had been come to an end. From that moment, the human body he had worn began its slow surrender. He would grow stronger and swifter than any man alive, and he would live on and on across the centuries, but the price was written into every day of that long life. He would never again be simply a young man walking under the sun. He would never marry as men marry, nor grow old as men grow old, nor lay down his burden as his father had been able to lay down his. He was trading the whole ordinary shape of a human life, with all its small sorrows and small joys, for a span of ages and a loneliness that no companion could ever fully ease. It is worth sitting a while with the largeness of that gift. Most of the endings we have walked among were things that happened to a person, sorrows that came upon them from without, betrayals and battles and the turning of fate. But this ending Leto chose with open eyes, for no reward that he himself would ever taste. He would not live to see the free and scattered humanity that his sacrifice would make possible. He would only labor toward it, day after day, and year after year, and century after century, holding the whole species to its long, slow lesson, so that others, unborn and unknowing, might one day walk out into a galaxy too wide and too wild for any tyrant ever to close his hand upon it again. And so the man called Leto II stepped quietly out of the ordinary world of men, not with a cry, but with a kind of grave and gentle acceptance, letting the desert begin to take him into itself. The change had begun that would carry him across the long ages to come, and the boy who had loved his sister and grieved his father and walked the sand of Arrakis gave himself over, freely, to be the guardian his people needed. Let that steadiness settle over you now, the deep calm of a choice made once and never again regretted. There is nothing frightening here, only a soul laying down the small self for the sake of the great whole, the way you now lay down the small cares of your day. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the desert quiet fold around you, and let yourself drift gently down into rest, carried by the memory of a love so wide it gave away a whole human life to keep the future open. Let us travel now across a great gulf of time, softly, the way a dream slides over many years in a single breath. When last we sat beside Leto II, he was a young man giving himself over to the living skin of the sand trout, beginning the slow change that would carry him far beyond the span of any ordinary life. Now we come to the far end of that change, across a distance of years so vast that whole peoples were born and grew old and passed away many times over while he reigned. Settle deeply now, and let the long, slow patience of ages gather around you, for this is the ending of the longest life in the whole tale of Dune. For something close to 3,500 years he ruled, and across all that immense span he was known as the God Emperor. In the deep quiet of his fortress at a place called the Sarir, he governed a humanity held gently and firmly upon the single narrow road he had chosen for its saving. The body he wore had continued its slow transformation across the long centuries, the sand trout skin drawing him ever further from the shape of a man and ever closer to the shape of the great desert worm from which the little creatures had come. By the end, he was an enormous thing, ridged and powerful, his human face grown small within a cowl at the front of a long and mighty body. A creature such as the world had never seen and would never see again. And yet within that strange and towering form, the same soul endured, the same patient will, the same memory reaching back across the thousands of years to a boy who had loved his sister on the sand of Arrakis. We should not let the strangeness of his form frighten us, for it was only the outward mark of the gift he had given. Every ridge and every length of that great body was the measure of how much he had surrendered so that others might live free. He had traded his humanity slowly, a little more with each passing age, and the price had been a loneliness so deep that few of us could even imagine its shape. He remembered being a man. He remembered warmth and love and the small, ordinary comforts, and he had let all of them go, and he had gone on holding humanity to its lesson long after any lesser soul would have laid the burden down. Across the millennia, he had grown weary in a way that no rest could ease, and part of him had long looked forward to the ending he had planned from the very beginning. For his death was not a thing that came upon him by surprise. Like so much in his long life, it was foreseen and shaped and quietly prepared, a final act toward which the whole of his great sacrifice had always been bending. He knew that his rule, however gentle, was still a kind of holding, a hand closed softly around his people to keep them upon the road until the road had done its work. And he knew that the last and greatest gift he could give them was to open that hand at last, to let his long guardianship come to its planned end, so that the pent-up longing of countless human hearts could finally break free. His death was to be the doorway through which his people would at last walk out into the wide unknown. And so we come to the place of his ending, a bridge above a river, in the green land his rule had made. Across the ages, his own labors had brought water back to what had once been the endless desert, and now a river ran where dunes had lain, and over that river stretched a high bridge along the path he was accustomed to travel. It was upon that bridge that his long life came to its close. In the ordinary way of such things there was struggle, and there were those who moved against him, and the great structure gave way beneath him, and the God-Emperor fell from the height of the bridge down toward the water below. Let us hold that fall gently, for it was not a defeat, but the very release he had so long awaited, the last step of the golden path, arriving exactly where he had always known it would. When the mighty body struck the water, a strange and wondrous thing began, a thing he had understood from the beginning, and had perhaps counted among the few consolations of his terrible long life. Water was death to the sand trout that made up his living skin, and death to the worm his body had become, and so the river began to undo him. But in that undoing there was no horror, only a kind of homecoming, a scattering that was also a seeding. As the great form came apart in the flowing water, the countless small sand trout that had once joined themselves to a young man's skin were loosed again, freed from the long unity of his body, and they slipped away into the wet sand of the riverbanks to begin their own small lives anew. The change that had made him was reversing at the last, and out of the ending of the God-Emperor came a scattering of the small creatures that would, in the slow turning of years, seed the desert once more with the pearls of its life. There is a deep and quiet rightness in this that we may rest upon. The boy had joined himself to the sand trout to begin his sacrifice, and now, at its close, the sand trout parted from him and went back into the sand to carry on the cycle of the desert he had loved. The human soul that had ridden that great body for 3,500 years was released from its long labor, set down at last after a burden borne beyond all reckoning. He had held humanity to its lesson through age upon age, and the lesson was learned, and now he could let go. His death was the final act of his great and terrible sacrifice, the loosening of the hand, the opening of the door. Let us honor what it bought. Through all those long millennia, he had endured loneliness so that others would never have to face extinction. He had worn a monstrous shape and a monstrous solitude so that his people, when at last he freed them, would pour out into a galaxy so vast and so various that no tyrant, no vision, no closing hand could ever gather them all up again. He gave his humanity, and then he gave his ages of rule, and then he gave his very body to the river, and in each giving there was the same steady love that had never once faltered across all that immense stretch of time. Few endings in all the tale carry so much meaning folded so quietly within them. So let him rest now, this greatest and strangest of all the fallen of Dune, the boy who became a worm, who became a god, who became, at the very last, a scattering of small living things slipping gently into the wet sand. Let the river carry away the long weariness of his ages. Let the loneliness dissolve into the flowing water as his body dissolved. Let the whole vast weight of 3,500 years lift softly from him and drift downstream into the dark, until nothing remains but the quiet banks and the small creatures burrowing into the sand and the great work finished at last. And let that same lifting come to you now, as the day's long weight loosens from your own shoulders and floats gently away. There is nothing to fear here, and nothing to hold, only a great soul set free after the longest of labors, and the soft sound of water, and the desert beginning once more. Let your breath slow like a river slowing, and let yourself drift down, gently and completely, into the deep still waters of sleep. Let us stay a little while in the calm that follows so great an ending, for something rises out of it that is worth holding softly before we let it go. The God Emperor has fallen from his bridge into the river, and his great body has come apart in the water. And the small creatures of his making have slipped away into the wet sand to begin the desert again. All across the many worlds of humankind, though most who lived upon them did not yet understand what had happened, a long holding had just been released. Let your breathing stay slow, and even as we watch what came of it, for this is the gentlest ending of all, an ending that opens into a beginning. For thousands of years the hand of Leto II had rested softly upon his people, keeping them close, keeping them upon the single narrow road that led away from their own quiet extinction. It had been a gentle hand, and a firm one, and it had held them through age upon age, teaching them without their knowing a lesson too large to be spoken aloud. Across all those centuries a longing had been building in the human heart, a pressure like water gathering behind a wall, a deep and restless wish to wander, to spread, to go out and never again be gathered into any single place where one blow might find them all. The very tightness of his long rule had been shaping that longing, pressing it and concentrating it, until it became a force greater than any empire. And when at last he opened his hand, when his long life came to its planned and willing end, that pent-up longing broke free all at once. Out across the settled worlds, in numbers beyond any counting, people rose up and turned their faces toward the far dark and began to go. They went outward in every direction, into regions of the galaxy where no map had ever reached, beyond the knowledge of any throne or any record, scattering themselves so widely and so wildly that no census could ever hope to follow them. This great outpouring came to be called the scattering, and it was the very thing the God Emperor had given everything to make possible, the harvest of his long and lonely sowing. There is a beauty in it that we may rest upon gently. All the endings we have walked among across these long nights had seemed, each in its own moment, like a closing, a loss, a light going out. The desert duel with Jameis that opened the whole road of sorrow, the poisoned tooth of Duke Leto, and the dignity he found in his fall, the doctor who died without his peace, and the planetologist alone beneath the open sky, and the loyal old mentat who chose his own quiet leaving. The lords of House Harkonnen swept away one by one, and the old emperor stripped of his throne. The swordmaster who died to save a boy and was born again across the ages. The loss of Chani and the passing of Paul into the sand, and the sorrowful fall of Aaliyah, and the long transformation of her nephew into the guardian of all humankind. Each had seemed an ending, and now, from the far side of the last and greatest of them, we can see that they were also a road, and that the road led here, to this vast pouring out of free people into the endless dark. For the deaths and the sacrifices of the whole long line had been, in their quiet way, the loosening of every chain. From Leto the Elder, the honorable Duke who fell at the very beginning, to Leto the Younger, the God Emperor who fell at the very end, the family had spent itself across the ages buying a single thing, and that thing was freedom, wide and unruly and beyond any recapture. Once the scattering had begun, no vision could ever again see the whole of humanity, for it had grown too vast and too various to be held in any single sight. No prescient eye, however powerful, could trace all the branching threads of a people spread so far. No tyrant could ever again close his hand around them all, for there was no longer any single place where all of them could be found. Humanity had passed forever beyond the reach of the trap that Leto had foreseen so long ago. Let us understand what that means, softly, for it is the meaning toward which the whole saga has been quietly bending. The great fear that had driven the God Emperor to give up his humanity was the fear of a people gathered too closely, dependent and comfortable and fragile, waiting all unknowing for the single blow that would end them. And the scattering was the undoing of that fear forever. However great a catastrophe might come, however dark a ruler might rise in some far corner of the spread of worlds, there would always be others, unnumbered and unfound, going on in the dark, beyond his knowing. The species could no longer be gathered, it could no longer be ended by any single hand. Out of so much ending had come, at last, a future that could not be closed. It is a strange and consoling thought to carry into the quiet that all the grief we have sat beside was not spent in vain. Every soul we have mourned across these nights had a place in this, whether they ever knew it or not. The proud warrior and the betrayed duke, the reluctant doctor and the dreaming planetologist, the loyal servant and the fallen lords, the beloved who died, bringing new life into the world, the emperor who walked into the desert, the haunted sister, the guardian who wore the skin of the worm for thousands of years. Each ending gave something. Each loss opened a little more of the road, and the road opened, in the end, onto a freedom so wide that it belonged not to any one of them, but to all the countless people who would ever come after, spilling outward into a galaxy too large for any sorrow to fill, and too vast for any tyranny to hold. So let us rest in that widening. Picture, if you like, that vast and gentle outpouring, uncountable souls turning toward the far dark and going, not in fear, but in longing, carrying the whole weight of the past behind them and the whole openness of the future before them. There is nothing frightening in it, only the deep relief of a door long shut, swinging softly open, only the quiet knowledge that after so much ending, life goes on, freer than it has ever been. The pressure that had built for ages is released, and the release is peaceful, like a long breath let go at the end of a long day. There is one more tenderness in this ending that we may gather before we let it go, and it is the tenderness of purpose fulfilled. Every long labor longs, in its deepest heart, to arrive at last at the thing it was always reaching toward. The God Emperor had labored longer than any soul in the whole tale, and the scattering was the arrival of his labor at its end. When the countless people poured outward into the far dark, they did not know his name, most of them, and they did not know what had been given so that they might go. And yet, they carried his gift in the very freedom of their going, the way a river carries the mountain rain long after the clouds that made it have drifted apart and vanished. His loneliness had become their liberty, and his long stillness had become their vast and joyful motion. There is a deep peace in a sacrifice that reaches, at the very last, the exact thing it was made for, and we may rest in that peace as we rest in the knowledge that the story has come, gently, to where it was always meant to go. Let that same release come to you now. Let the gathered weight of your own day loosen and go out into the dark, scattering softly away from you until nothing of it remains to hold you here. There is no chain upon you now, nothing you must carry, nowhere you must be. Only the wide and quiet openness of rest, spreading around you as gently as the scattering spread across the stars. Let your breath grow slow and easy. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and let yourself drift outward into the soft and boundless dark of sleep, free and unhurried and at peace. And now we come to the last and gentlest part of our long walk together, the quiet gathering at the end, when the road is behind us and there is nothing left to do but rest. You need not follow closely now. You need not hold on to anything at all. Let these final words move over you like a warm tide going out, and let the many endings we have walked among settle softly into place, no longer as sorrows to be carried, but as a quiet understanding to be laid down. Breathe slowly and let the whole long story come to rest within you. We have traveled a great distance across these nights, from the first days on the desert world of Arrakis all the way to the far scattering of humankind into the endless dark. We began beside a desert duel, where a proud warrior named Jameis fell and a boy took his first life and mourned it. And we saw how one sorrow can mark the beginning of a heavier road. We sat with Duke Leto and his poisoned tooth, and we saw a man find dignity even in his fall. We grieved the doctor who betrayed for love and died without his peace, and the planetologist left alone beneath the open sky with his dream of a green world still bright in his mind. We honored the loyal old Mentat who chose his own quiet leaving rather than harm the house he loved. We watched the cruel lords of House Harkonnen swept away one by one, the brutish nephew and the polished heir, and the old Baron himself, undone at last by the smallest and least expected hand. We saw the great emperor stripped not of his life, but of his throne, a dynasty of long years quietly ending. And through it all we followed the swordmaster, Duncan, who died to save a boy and was grown again and again across the ages, a thread of loyalty that not even death could finish. We came to the deep sorrows near the heart of the tale, the loss of Chani, who died bringing new life into the world, and the passing of Paul into the sand, giving himself gently to the desert rather than lingering as a fading god. And then we walked on into the long ages beyond, to the haunted sister overwhelmed by the voices she could not silence, who reclaimed at the last the choosing of her own release. To her nephew, who saw a single narrow road that could save all of humankind and gave up his human body to walk it. To the God Emperor, who wore the skin of the worm for thousands of years and fell at last from his bridge into the river, scattering into the small creatures that would seed the desert anew. And to the great outpouring that his death set free, the scattering, in which countless people went out into the wide dark, forever beyond the reach of any hand that might have closed around them. So many endings, and yet notice, as you lie here in the quiet, how none of them feels sharp any longer. That is the gift of walking through them slowly and with tenderness, of sitting beside each one the way you might sit beside a candle burning low. Seen from close up, each death was a loss, a light going out, a grief for those who remained. But seen from the far end of the whole long tale, each was also a giving, a small door opening onto what came after. The duel with Jameis opened Paul's road among the Fremen. The fall of the Duke and all the sorrows that followed opened the rise of a new order, and the long sacrifice of the God Emperor opened the widest door of all onto a future so free that no vision could ever again close it. Think, for a moment, how strange and how kind it is that a tale so full of endings should leave us feeling not heavier but lighter. We came, at the very first, wondering whether it was a heavy thing to carry so many deaths into the quiet before sleep. And now, having walked among them all, we find that they have grown soft in the carrying, that each one, held gently and understood, has lost its power to frighten and kept only its power to move us. That is what happens to sorrow when it is given time and tenderness. It does not vanish, and we would not want it to, for it is the very shape of how much these people mattered. But it settles. It cools, the way a flame settles into warm embers, and the embers give a gentle heat long after the sharpness of the fire is gone. So it is with all the endings of this saga. They have become a warmth rather than a wound. This is the quiet truth the whole saga has been offering us, and we may hold it now as softly as a warm stone in the hand. Grief and meaning are woven together, threaded through one another so closely that you cannot pull them apart. There is no ending in this tale that gave nothing, and no sorrow that did not, in its own slow way, become a gift to those who lived on. The ones we mourned were not erased by their endings. They live on in what their endings made possible, in the freedom that spread out from all their many sacrifices, in the long, unbroken line of loyalty and love and courage that ran from the first fall to the last. That is a gentle thing to know, and a true one, and it asks nothing more of you tonight than that you let it rest. So, let it rest. Let every sorrow we have gathered across these nights settle now into that soft understanding, and having settled there, let it grow quiet and let it go. You do not need to hold any of it. You never did. It was only ever a long procession of stories to drift through as sleep gathered around you. And now the procession has reached its end, and there is nothing left before you but rest. The desert is quiet. The river runs softly in the dark. The wide free dark of the scattering stretches out beyond all counting, peaceful and boundless and calm. Notice how quiet the room has become around you, how the sounds of the world have grown distant and soft, no longer asking anything of you. Notice how far away the day already feels, its worries and its tasks drifting off like small boats carried out on an easy tide. You have walked a long road tonight, through the whole vast turning of a great story, and now the road has brought you home to this, to the warmth of your own slow breathing and the gentle weight of your own resting body. There is nothing more to understand. There is nothing more to feel. There is only the settling, deep and unhurried, of a mind that has laid its long tail down and found it good. Let your body grow heavy and warm, sinking a little deeper with every slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and your hands, and the long muscles of your back, all the small held places of the day, loosening at last and letting go. Let the softness spread down through your legs and out to the very tips of your fingers, until every part of you feels cradled and calm and wonderfully far from waking. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. The weight of the day has slipped from your shoulders, one slow breath at a time, just as we said it would at the very beginning. And now there is only the quiet and the warmth and the gentle pull of sleep. Let each sorrow rest. Let each soul we walked beside lie down in peace, their long stories finished, their gifts given, their endings understood and forgiven and released. And let yourself rest with them, carried softly out past the edge of waking, past all thought and all memory, into the deep and dreamless calm that has been waiting for you all along. Breathe and let go, and drift and sleep. Rest now. Rest and sleep and be at peace. And so our long, gentle walk among the fallen of Dune comes softly to its close. We have traveled the whole arc of the saga by way of its endings, and we have met each one not with fear, but with a quiet and patient tenderness. We began upon the sands of Arrakis with the desert duel that took the warrior Jameis, and we followed the fall of House Atreides through the poisoned tooth of Duke Leto and the sorrow of the doctor who betrayed him. We sat beside the loyal Mentat who chose his own leaving, and beside the dreamer left alone beneath the open sky. We watched the cruel lords of House Harkonnen swept away one after another, the beast and the polished heir and the old baron undone at last by the smallest hand. We saw an emperor deposed rather than slain, and a swordmaster who died to save a boy and was grown again across the ages, dying and returning like a faithful memory that would not end. We came to the blinding of Muad'Dib, and to the loss of Chani, whom he loved most freely, and to the day Paul walked alone into the desert and gave himself to the sand. And we followed his son Leto II through the longest sacrifice of all, the giving up of a human life to wear the skin of the worm for thousands of years, until upon a bridge above a river his great burden was finally laid down, and humanity was set free. There is nothing left now that you must remember. You may let all of these endings soften and blur together, and let the names drift away like desert wind at nightfall. Each one gave something to those who lived on after it, and now each one may rest. The story will keep itself, and it will be here again whenever you wish to return to it. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and let your thoughts settle like fine sand coming slowly to rest. There is nothing to hold, and nothing to carry, and nothing more to do tonight but breathe, and rest, and drift. Let the last of the words dissolve, and let yourself sink the rest of the way down into deep and peaceful sleep. Good night. And whenever you would like to wander once more through these quiet stories of the stars, this soft voice will be waiting to begin again.